the neighbor who never left his house in upstate New York. By the time the porch light came on again, the man who had lived there was supposed to be gone. It happened just after midnight, when the houses on that road had already gone dark and the trees beyond the back fences had become one black wall. A woman across the street woke for no clear reason, crossed her bedroom in bare feet, and looked through the lace curtain toward the old narrow house with the peeling white paint. The front room was lit. Not brightly, just enough to show the long shape of the window and the faint shadow of someone moving past it, slow and deliberate, as if crossing a room he had crossed 1,000 times before. She stood there until the shape disappeared. In the morning, she told herself she had dreamed it. By breakfast, she remembered that the man next door had not been seen for days, and that 2 men from the county had already been there once, pulling shut the front door behind them as they left. He had been the kind of neighbor people described in fragments: quiet, thin, older than he first looked from a distance, younger than he seemed when he stepped into the light. He collected his mail at odd hours. In winter, he shoveled one narrow path from the porch to the sidewalk and nowhere else. In summer, he cut only the strip of grass visible from the road, leaving the backyard to grow wild and silver under the moon. No one on the street could say with confidence where he had come from or whether he had family nearby. There were stories, of course, because there were always stories around a house where the curtains stayed drawn and no visitors ever parked at the curb. Some said he had once worked nights. Some said he had lost someone and never recovered. Some said he simply did not like being seen. What people did know was that he was still there, until suddenly he was not. According to neighbors, the change began with the smell. Not a strong smell at first, just something stale drifting down the sidewalk in the wet cold of early spring, mixing with thawing mud and old leaves. Then came the newspapers left untouched on the porch, then the milk bottles, on the rare weeks he ordered them, standing where the morning frost had clouded the glass. A mail carrier knocked and received no answer. A neighbor mentioned it to another neighbor. By the end of that week, someone made the call to 911, feeling foolish even as she did it, as though bothering the dispatcher over a man who had spent years making it clear he wanted no one's concern. The deputies came in daylight. They went around the side yard first, their shoes disappearing in the high grass, then returned to the front. One knocked. The other looked into the lower corner of a window and stepped back at once. A little later, an ambulance came and then left without haste. No one on the street said much afterward. They only watched. The front door was shut, the curtains remained closed, the county car drove away. By evening, the house looked exactly as it had the day before, except for the fact that people now understood, in that quiet suburban way, that the man who had lived there would not be seen again. No obituary appeared that anyone could find. No relatives came to empty the rooms. No realtor's sign appeared in the yard. The mailbox remained. The porch light stayed off for nearly a week. Then, on the 7th night, it came back on. At first, people reached for sensible explanations because that was easier than letting a small wrong thing become a larger one. A timer, someone said. An electrical fault. A distant cousin with a key. The county had probably not done much beyond securing the door. Houses did strange things when they were left alone. Pipes clicked. Lights flickered. Old floorboards shifted. A curtain with a loose hem could move in a draft and look like a hand. Then the kitchen light came on too. It happened while rain passed over the neighborhood in fine gray sheets that made the street lamps hum. The house stood dim and square against the weather, the upstairs dark, the front room lit as before. Then, without warning, a yellow light appeared in the rear of the house, the kind of warm, square light that suggested someone rinsing a cup at the sink or standing motionless at a counter. It stayed on for nearly an hour. When it finally went out, the front room remained lit. Just before dawn, both lights died at once. A retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Harrow, who had lived on that street longer than anyone else, claimed she saw more than light. She had been awake in her downstairs chair, knitting with the television muted, when she noticed a shape pass the sheer curtain in the front window. Not quickly, not with the nervous pace of a trespasser. It moved with the private slowness of a resident who knew where every chair and table stood in the dark. She later told one neighbor that what unsettled her was not the figure itself, but the interval between one pass and the next. It crossed once. Then again, several minutes later, in exactly the same direction, at exactly the same speed, as if repeating a habit rather than accomplishing anything. The next afternoon, a younger man from 3 houses down walked over and knocked. He had a delivery package in his hand, though there had been no delivery. He only wanted a reason to stand on the porch and listen. The boards creaked under his weight. The brass knocker was cold. He waited after the sound of his knock had faded and thought, just for a second, that he heard something inside. Not footsteps. Not speech, the small, dry scrape of a chair leg moving over a floor. He left the package there anyway, a blank cardboard box with nothing in it, and glanced back twice before reaching the sidewalk. By evening, the box was gone. That was when the street stopped speaking about the house in open daylight. It became the sort of subject that entered conversation only after dark, in kitchens with one overhead bulb and the low clink of dishes, or on porches where voices carried no farther than the railing. People began comparing details they had kept to themselves. One woman said she heard the back door open and close sometime after 2 a.m., though the yard remained empty when she looked. A boy home from college said he saw a dim shape standing at the second-floor window in a room no one remembered ever seeing lit while the man was alive. Mrs. Harrow insisted there was a rhythm to the house now. Front room first, kitchen later, sometimes the stair landing after midnight. Once, unmistakably, the bathroom light, which glowed weak and green through textured glass before vanishing again. Someone contacted the county office to ask whether the property had been turned over to anyone. The answer, according to the person who made the call, was unsatisfying. Records were pending. There had been difficulty locating next of kin, the property was not yet cleared for sale, no one could say whether anyone had official access in the meantime. It was not the kind of answer that settled a neighborhood. It was the kind that left a thin opening for anything to be imagined. The most disturbing detail surfaced near the midpoint of that strange month, and it came from the least dramatic witness on the street. A postal worker, filling in on the route, mentioned in passing that the mailbox at the old house had been emptied twice that week. Not stuffed, not overflowing, emptied. He remembered because the box was old and stiff and needed to be tugged hard to open, and on both mornings it had swung lightly, recently handled. He did not know the story behind the house. He only remarked on it to another carrier. By the time the comment reached the neighbors, it no longer sounded ordinary. After that, people began looking more carefully. From certain angles, the house could be watched without appearing watched. Between 2 hedges on the opposite side of the road, there was a narrow view of the side entrance. From the second floor of Mrs. Harrow's house there was a direct line to the upstairs landing through a gap where the curtain never fully closed. A man with insomnia started smoking in his garage with the door open 2 inches, using the reflective strip of the window glass to monitor the porch across the street. He later said the waiting became worse than the sightings. Minutes stretched, the road stayed empty, nothing moved. Then some small change would happen inside the house, and all the silence around it seemed to retreat by an inch. One night, during a windstorm that bent the maple branches almost to the gutters, the front door opened. It did not swing wide, it eased inward and stopped, revealing only darkness beyond the storm screen. The porch light burned over the chipped steps. Leaves skittered along the pavement. No one stepped out. The door remained open through the worst of the wind, gently shifting on its hinges, until a gust struck the screen hard enough to rattle it. Then, with no visible hand, it closed again. The next morning, there were no footprints in the damp soil of the flower bed, no marks in the wet grit on the porch, no sign that anyone had crossed the threshold. But the doormat had been turned sideways. Local gossip began attaching itself to older stories, the way damp fabric collects burrs. Someone remembered hearing that the man had once cared for an invalid relative inside that house and had continued speaking to empty rooms long after the relative died. Someone else claimed the house had belonged to his mother before him and that she too had been seen at windows after her funeral, though no one could say who first told that story. Another neighbor, trying to sound rational, suggested there might be a squatter entering from the cellar, but even he spoke softly when he said it, because the image of a hidden living intruder was somehow worse than the alternatives. At last, 2 men from the town returned with a locksmith and a patrol car. It was afternoon again, cloudy and cold. Curtains shifted all along the street as people watched from indoors. The men knocked first. Then they unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. They remained there long enough for the onlookers to grow restless. When they emerged, one of them carried a paper bag. The other stood on the porch, speaking into a phone, his face unreadable from that distance. Before leaving, they nailed a notice to the door and stretched tape across the frame. It looked final, official, almost comforting. That night, the front room light came on behind the taped door. No one on the street admitted sleeping well after that. The tape remained unbroken for 3 days. Through the front window, when the light was on, it could be seen plainly across the glass panel of the door, pale and taut. This detail lodged itself in people's minds because it ruined every easy explanation. If someone had gone in through the front, the tape would have torn. If someone had left by that route, the notice would have shifted. Yet the lights still moved from room to room in a patient sequence, and once, close to dawn, Mrs. Harrow said she saw a shadow pause just inside the doorway where the notice faced inward, as though reading it. The heavy reveal came later, when curiosity overcame caution in the only person on the street foolish enough to act alone. His name has been lost in the retelling, or perhaps people no longer say it out of fairness. He was younger than most of the residents, rented rather than owned, and worked odd hours that made him too familiar with the long, empty stretch between midnight and sunrise. On a night when the house was lit downstairs and the road was empty, he crossed over with a flashlight and went around the back. He would later describe the yard as unnaturally still, no crickets. No distant traffic, even the loose branch over the shed seemed to hold itself in place. At the rear door, he found no tape, only a rusted knob and a small window dark with grime. He pressed his ear to it and heard what he first took for water running somewhere far inside. When he looked through the glass, the beam of his flashlight caught the edge of a kitchen table, a sink full of dull reflections, and beyond that, a hallway opening into deeper darkness. On the table sat the cardboard package he himself had left on the front porch days earlier. It had been opened with care. The top flaps were folded back neatly. Inside the empty box lay a stack of mail bound with twine. He backed away at once, circled toward the side yard, and nearly ran into the thing that frightened him enough to leave town before summer. There was someone at the upstairs window. Not a face pressed against the pane, not a theatrical apparition, just the unmistakable outline of a person standing in profile where the curtain failed to meet the frame. Shoulders slightly bowed, one hand lifted near the chin, still as furniture. He said later that he would have convinced himself it was a coat on a hanger if not for one detail. The outline shifted its weight. Only a little, but enough to be human, enough that he stumbled backward in the wet grass and dropped the flashlight. By the time he found it and aimed it up again, the window was empty. The police came because he called them, breathing hard and ashamed. They searched again. According to later talk, they found the rear door locked from within and had to force it. They went through the rooms one by one. Nothing. No intruder, no bedding, no food opened recently beyond what had spoiled weeks before. The cardboard box was indeed on the kitchen table, along with the old mail, though no one could explain how it had entered the house. What they did find, in the back parlor beneath a layer of dust, was an armchair positioned toward the front window. The carpet before it was worn in an oval. Beside the chair stood a lamp plugged into a timer. On the mantel was a second timer attached to nothing. Upstairs, on the landing, another lamp had been set facing the hall. In the bathroom, the weak green bulb had burned almost to black. This should have settled everything. Timers could explain the lights, the worn carpet could explain the passing shadow, the rest could be fear and gossip arranging scraps into a pattern. But the chair in the back parlor was warm. One officer reportedly touched the armrest while checking the room and drew his hand back in surprise. Not hot, not heated by a vent, simply warm, as if someone had risen from it only moments before. That detail was never put into any public record anyone saw, and perhaps it never happened at all. Yet it persisted, carried from one kitchen to another, from one porch to the next, because it fit too neatly with everything people had half believed already. In neighborhoods like that, what is missing from the record often survives longer than what is written down. After the second search, the house was finally cleared out. Months later, workers came, the curtains were taken down, the old furniture was removed. Windows were opened for the first time in years, and stale air poured into the street with the smell of dust, wet plaster, and something older underneath. By autumn, the place had been sold to a couple from farther south. They painted the siding, cut back the yard, replaced the porch light, and told anyone who asked that the house felt smaller inside than they expected. They stayed until the first snow. No one ever got a full explanation for why they left so quickly. The official reason, according to a neighbor who spoke with them once while they loaded a truck, was that the commute was wrong and the repairs were more expensive than planned. Yet after they were gone, Mrs. Harrow mentioned that on several cold evenings, she had seen the husband standing in the yard, not looking at the road or the roofline, but at the upstairs landing window, with the expression of a man listening for a sound that had not yet started. The house passed through other hands after that. Time softened the story. Children who grew up nearby remembered only that there had been a place adults disliked discussing. The original resident became less a person than a shape inside a rumor, a solitary man in a narrow house whose departure had not ended his routine. Records thinned, witnesses died or moved away. The county notice vanished. Trees grew taller. New owners came and went. Even now, according to people who still live on roads like that in upstate New York, there are winter nights when a certain kind of silence settles over a block and one house appears brighter than it should be, though no car sits in the drive and no footsteps mark the snow. A lamp glows in the front room, a shadow passes once behind the curtain. Then, minutes later, it passes again at the same slow pace, repeating a path known too well to be broken by death. And the most unsettling part of the old story is not the thought that someone remained in that house after he was believed gone. It is the smaller, colder possibility that he never understood he had left at all and simply continued with the only life he had, moving from room to room, collecting the mail, turning on the lights, and pausing sometimes at the window to look out at the neighbors who had finally begun to look back. The man who knew too much about them in Los Angeles. By the time the second voicemail arrived, the family had already stopped answering unknown numbers. The first one had been strange enough. A man with a low, even voice had asked whether the hallway light had been fixed yet and whether the child was still afraid of the sound the pipes made after midnight. He spoke as if he had lived in the apartment with them, as if he knew the small, private discomforts that never left the walls. On the second message, he mentioned a broken dish that had not fallen yet and a visit from police that had not happened. He ended both calls the same way, with a pause so long it sounded like listening, and then a soft, almost thoughtful good night. The reports that later circulated in Los Angeles were always incomplete in the same frustrating way. They described a pattern without ever quite finding its center. According to people who spoke to investigators, the calls did not begin with threats, they began with knowledge. The caller knew which bedroom window stuck in humid weather. He knew which relative had recently moved away. He knew that one tenant kept a coffee mug by the sink with a hairline crack running through the handle. He knew what time the dog in the neighboring unit usually started scratching at the front door. These were not facts anyone would place online. They were not dramatic enough to be shared and too small to seem important until a stranger began saying them aloud. The family at the center of the case, or at least the family most often mentioned when the story is retold, had moved into an aging apartment building on a side street west of downtown. It was the sort of place that always looked tired even in full sun. The lobby smelled faintly of bleach, old paper, and rainwater trapped in concrete. The mailboxes rattled when buses passed. At night, the corridors took on that strange apartment stillness, where every tiny sound seemed to travel too far. Footsteps on another floor could seem close enough to belong to someone standing just outside the door. They were ordinary in the way many people become ordinary inside stories like this. A couple, a young child, a grandmother who stayed with them off and on, a narrow living room, secondhand furniture, a television that gave off a dull electric warmth long after it had been switched off. Neighbors later said they kept to themselves. Nothing about them invited attention. That, in some quiet way, made the case worse. The first events that unsettled them could still be explained. A package moved from the front mat to the windowsill, a kitchen cabinet left open, the grandmother insisting she had heard someone speak in the hall outside at 3 o'clock in the morning, though no footsteps followed. Then came the phone calls. Sometimes the man called late in the evening, sometimes near dawn. Once, according to one account, the phone rang just after the child woke, crying from a dream, and the caller asked whether the nightmare had been about the red water again. No one in the apartment had spoken about that dream outside the home. After that, fear settled in by degrees. It did not arrive all at once. It thickened the air instead. The couple checked locks twice, then 3 times. They closed the blinds before sunset. They lowered their voices without quite knowing why. The grandmother began covering the peephole with a folded square of tissue, saying she did not like the feeling of an eye meeting hers through it. In daylight, the apartment remained ordinary. Laundry piled in corners, sunlight crossed the floor in long, pale bars. The refrigerator hummed, the child watched cartoons, someone boiled water for tea. But each evening, as the building darkened and the corridor outside flattened into shadow, the rooms seemed to draw inward. Then the caller mentioned the woman from downstairs. He asked whether she had stopped by yet to complain about the leak. At that point, no one from downstairs had come up, there had been no complaint, the ceiling below was still dry. The family listened to the message twice, then a third time, standing in the kitchen with the overhead light buzzing faintly above them. The grandmother turned toward the ceiling as if she could hear water gathering inside it. The next afternoon, the downstairs tenant knocked on the door with a hard, irritated look and said there was a stain spreading above her bathroom mirror. The police were contacted not long after that, though exactly when depends on whose version is being told. Some say officers came after the voicemail about the leak. Some say the family waited until the caller described the child's school backpack, including the fading cartoon patch stitched near the zipper. Either way, the first formal response appears to have been cautious. Harassing calls, possible stalking, nothing yet that could be pinned to a face. The officers asked practical questions in calm voices. Had anyone recently been in the apartment for repairs? Had there been arguments with neighbors? Had the family given out personal information? They took notes beside the front window while afternoon traffic drifted outside in a long metallic hush. Then they left, promising follow-up. That night, another message appeared. The same voice said the officers had forgotten a pen on the radiator cover, and he was right. He also said one of them would come back alone because he had left part of his report unfinished. According to the family, the apartment seemed to go still around those words. The refrigerator stopped humming. The pipes made a sound like a throat being cleared deep inside the wall. The child, who had been playing on the floor, looked up without speaking. Less than an hour later, there was a knock at the door, and one of the officers stood outside, apologetic, asking if he had left his pen. Stories like this often grow around their own emptiness. Where facts end, rumor begins laying down its thin, cold layers. Some later believed the caller must have been watching from inside the building. Others suspected an employee, a former tenant, someone who knew how sound moved through the place and where vents carried conversation. There were quieter theories too. A maintenance worker with keys, a neighbor nobody noticed, someone who had become obsessed not with harming the family at first, but with proving that privacy in a city could be peeled away one detail at a time. Yet the part that remained hardest to explain was not how he knew the present, it was how he seemed to know what came next. He spoke of small things first, the kind of things that could be called lucky guesses if taken one by one. He said the grandmother would cut her thumb on a can lid. She did. He mentioned that the child would lose a tooth at school and come home frightened by the blood. That happened too. He said a framed picture near the television would fall during the night, and before morning, the glass would be broken across the rug in glittering pieces. The family moved the frame into a drawer after hearing that message, but another picture, one no one had thought about, slipped from a shelf after midnight and shattered in the dark. With each correct detail, the apartment changed. It became less like shelter and more like a place already known to someone else. They stopped discussing plans inside it. They took walks just to talk privately, though even then they lowered their voices when passing parked cars. The child began sleeping in the living room with the television on low, not watching it, only needing the murmur of people who were not there. The grandmother insisted that whoever was doing this had been inside before because some knowledge could not be gathered from windows or walls alone. She said there was a difference between being watched and being remembered. Investigators, according to later accounts, tried tracing the calls. Some were routed through services that obscured origin, others ended too quickly. One call appeared to come from a public phone that no longer existed by the time officers checked. Another was linked to a convenience store where no clerk remembered the man who used it. These details, repeated over the years, gave the case its urban legend shape. Los Angeles is full of places where one person can vanish into the machinery of the city. Light, traffic, distance, apartment blocks stacked close as filing cabinets, every face passing a bus stop can look temporary. The family prepared to leave. That much seems consistent across versions. Boxes appeared in the apartment, clothes were folded and refolded, important papers disappeared into a single taped envelope. They told almost no one. The plan, if it can be called that, was to go quietly and break whatever chain had bound this man to them. The grandmother wrapped dishes in newspaper at the dining table while dusk pooled in the corners of the room. The child asked whether the new place would have the same pipes. No one answered. On the final night in the apartment, the voicemail arrived before sunset. It was shorter than the others. The man said there was no point packing the blue suitcase first because the zipper would fail again. He said they should keep the medicine in reach because the grandmother would feel faint on the stairs. Then, after a pause, he said something that was remembered differently by different people, but all versions share the same shape. He referred to a knock at the door that would come later and warned them not to open it until the third knock. There had never been a pattern of 3 knocks. Darkness gathered slowly outside the windows. The building seemed unusually quiet, as if other residents had stepped out of it all at once. The grandmother sat with one hand over the packed envelope of documents. The couple checked the locks. The child slept early on a folded blanket, face turned toward the television glow. Now and then, a car passed below and cast moving bands of light across the ceiling. The blue suitcase, left open near the bedroom door, had indeed snagged at the zipper. Nobody said that aloud. At some point after midnight, someone knocked. Once, the sound was soft, almost polite. Every person in the apartment heard it. The grandmother looked toward the door without moving. The second knock came after a long pause, louder this time, enough to wake the child. The mother held him close. The father stood in the narrow hallway between living room and door, not approaching, just listening. Outside, there were no footsteps, no voice, no rattle of keys. Only the old building holding its breath around them. The third knock never came. Instead, the phone rang. Not the mobile phone, the apartment phone, the old one near the kitchen wall that had carried most of the calls. Its ring cut through the silence with a flat mechanical force that made the child cry out. No one moved to answer it at first. It rang and rang, each burst seeming louder than the last, until finally the father crossed the room and lifted the receiver with a hand that later would not stop shaking. At first, there was only breathing. Then, the familiar voice said, very gently, that he had told them not to open the door until the third knock, and that now it was too late anyway because the person outside had gone. The father asked who it was. The caller did not answer. Instead, he asked whether the officer had come back yet. There was no officer expected that night. According to the most repeated version, there came then a new sound from the corridor, distant but distinct, as if someone at the far end had begun walking toward the apartment with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, unbroken movement over old hallway flooring. The father stood frozen with the receiver to his ear. The breathing on the line matched nothing and explained nothing. The grandmother began whispering under her breath in a language the child did not understand. The footsteps came closer, then stopped directly outside the door. This time there was no knock. Something brushed the metal of the knob once, lightly, like fingertips testing temperature. Then silence. The caller remained on the line for several more seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a way no one later described the same way. Some said it sounded pleased, some said it sounded disappointed. One account says it sounded farther away, almost hollow, as though he had stepped into a larger room. He said only that they should leave before morning because after morning it would become difficult to tell who had been inside. The line went dead. They left before dawn. That part is treated as fact. Bags, child, documents, blue suitcase with the bad zipper. They went down the stairwell because no one trusted the elevator. On the landing between floors, the grandmother did become faint. The envelope of papers slipped from her lap and scattered. One sheet drifted against the railing and hung there for a moment before dropping into the dim shaft below. The father later said he had the strange certainty, while gathering them, that someone on the floor beneath was standing perfectly still and looking up through the central opening of the stairs. When he forced himself to look, he saw only darkness and the pale rectangle of a lower hallway. After they left, the case thinned. New address, changed numbers, fewer public details. Publicly discussed incidents like this do not always end with arrests or explanations. Sometimes they end with distance, with silence, with a family deciding that survival is enough and clarity is not owed to anyone. There were said to be no further calls for a while. Then there were rumors of one more, months later, to a phone number almost no one had. In that final message, the caller reportedly asked whether the child still remembered the hallway with no third knock. That part has never been confirmed. What remained in local retellings was the apartment itself. Tenants came and went, managers changed, paint went over old scuffs, carpets were replaced. Still, people in the building are said to have talked about the family who moved out before sunrise and never returned for the rest of their things. A neighbor claimed a box of kitchenware stayed in the manager's office for weeks. Another said the unit was empty longer than it should have been and that maintenance workers disliked entering after dark. Someone else insisted the old phone jack in the kitchen was removed because it kept picking up dead air. The most unsettling detail survives in the smallest form. According to one version of the story, investigators reviewing notes from the early calls found that the man had mentioned a minor event no one recognized at the time. He said that before everything ended, one of them would look back from the stairwell and think they saw a person standing inside the apartment they had just locked. Not at the door, farther in, near the living room window where the evening light used to fall. Only later did the father remember that moment. He had looked back once while carrying the blue suitcase. He had seen, through the narrow opening before the door latched, what seemed to be a figure already inside the room, motionless and waiting in the dimness. He convinced himself it had been a coat hanging from a chair. That is what he told himself then, that is what he told police later. But years afterward, when the story had become a half-whispered Los Angeles cautionary tale and the details had begun to blur at the edges, the one thing he reportedly remained certain about was this: the figure had not been near the chair. An Idaho fire tower report from 2003 was never released. The final entry in the publicly released logbook for the Black Mountain Fire Tower simply read, "Weather clear, visibility 10 miles, no smoke detected." But according to internal forestry documents leaked nearly 2 decades later, the actual handwritten log from August 9, 2003 did not end there. It continued for another 14 pages, cataloging a sequence of events that began at 11:45 p.m. The missing pages did not describe a forest fire, a trespassing hiker, or a sudden storm. Instead, the observer stationed at the tower documented an encounter that began with the ambient sound of the forest abruptly and completely ceasing. The Black Mountain Tower stood 65 feet above a dense, unbroken canopy in the remote reaches of the Clearwater National Forest. It was a standard architectural design for the region, a glass-walled box measuring roughly 14 by 14 feet, accessible only by a steep, exposed wooden staircase. The lookout on duty that summer was a 24-year-old seasonal employee. His name was redacted in all the leaked files, referred to only as the Observer. For the first 6 weeks of his post, his reports were entirely routine, filled with mundane details about humidity, wind speed, and distant lightning strikes. But the August 9th entry shifted in tone almost immediately after nightfall, noting a sudden drop in temperature and a strange, localized fog creeping through the pines directly below his structure. By midnight, the observer reported that his two-way radio had begun emitting a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. He wrote that he initially assumed it was atmospheric interference and attempted to contact the regional dispatcher. The channel, however, was completely choked by a thick, heavy static. He noted in his log that the pulse sounded biological, like a slow, amplified heartbeat broadcasting directly over the emergency frequency. He turned the volume down, but the vibration of the speaker still rattled against the wooden desk. Seeking the source of the interference, he stepped out onto the narrow metal catwalk that surrounded the glass cabin. The air outside was dead calm. There was no wind to move the trees, yet the observer claimed he could hear the distinct sound of heavy branches snapping in the dark, roughly 200 feet below his position. The logbook described the observer retrieving a high-powered, handheld spotlight from his supply locker. He leaned over the railing and swept the bright beam over the tree line, expecting to catch the reflective eyes of a black bear or a stray elk wandering through the underbrush. Instead, the beam illuminated a patch of the forest floor where the shadows simply did not behave correctly. According to his written account, a cluster of tall, pale shapes stood perfectly still among the dark trunks of the pines. They were thin, much taller than any human, and blended almost seamlessly with the pale bark of the birch trees. The observer noted with a clinical, terrifying detachment that the figures were completely hairless and unnaturally smooth. When the harsh light hit them, they did not scatter or flinch. They simply leaned backward, slipping out of the illuminated circle with a smooth, liquid motion that defied the anatomy of any known animal. At 1:15 a.m., the observer wrote that the pulsing sound on the radio had finally stopped. It was immediately replaced by a faint, wet clicking noise coming from outside the glass walls. He turned off all the lanterns inside the cabin, plunging himself into total darkness so his eyes could adjust to the moonlight and he could see the catwalk. The narrow metal walkway was empty, but the clicking continued. It sounded like long, hardened fingernails tapping rhythmically against the wooden support beams holding the massive tower aloft. The sound was not stationary, it was slowly, methodically moving upward. 10 feet off the ground, 20 feet, 30 feet. Something was climbing the sheer wooden structure, but it was entirely avoiding the wooden stairs. The observer documented his own rising panic with a strange, methodical precision, as if relying on protocol was the only way to maintain his sanity. He recorded the exact time he secured the heavy trapdoor that covered the stairwell entrance. He noted checking the locks on the heavy glass doors on all four sides of the cabin. A few minutes later, he wrote that the thick timber framing of the tower was beginning to groan under an immense shifting weight. Whatever was scaling the exterior was heavy enough to make the 65-foot structure sway slightly, mimicking the motion it usually made only in gale force winds. Yet, the night outside remained perfectly still. There was no breeze to stir the pines, there was only the creaking wood and the relentless, wet clicking ascending the eastern supports. At 2:30 a.m., the tapping stopped just below the edge of the catwalk. The observer sat perfectly still in the center of the dark room, gripping a heavy flashlight, waiting for a face to appear in the windows. For nearly 10 minutes, there was absolute, suffocating silence. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness outside the reinforced glass. The logbook recorded that the voice belonged to the regional dispatcher, the familiar woman who took his daily weather reports. But the dispatcher was stationed at a secure facility more than 30 miles away. Furthermore, the voice lacked any human inflection or breath. It simply repeated the phrase, "Observer status check, observer status check," over and over, with the flat, mechanical cadence of a skipping audio recording. The observer did not answer the voice. He remained motionless on the floorboards, barely daring to breathe. He wrote that when he failed to respond, the voice outside began to change. It distorted, deepening into a hollow, metallic drone, though it continued to repeat the exact same phrase. A few moments later, a second voice joined it from the western side of the catwalk. This one sounded like a young child crying softly, a sound that had no logical place in the middle of a remote wilderness in the dead of night. Then a third voice joined the chorus, flawlessly mimicking the rhythmic, low-frequency pulse he had heard earlier on his radio. A chaotic symphony of impossible sounds drifted through the thin glass panes surrounding the cabin entirely. The observer realized they were trying to provoke a response, attempting to trick him into speaking so they could pinpoint his exact location within the dark room. At 3:14 a.m., the observer managed to write his second-to-last entry. The handwriting had become shaky, the letters pressed deeply into the paper. He wrote that a face had finally pressed itself against the glass on the northern side of the cabin. He could only see its outline in the dim moonlight. He described it as impossibly long, pale, and completely smooth, entirely lacking eyes, a nose, or any discernible human features. It had only a wide, dark fissure where a mouth should be. As he watched in paralyzed horror, a long, multi-jointed hand reached up into view and began testing the brass handle of the outer door. The handle turned slowly, clanking heavily against the locked mechanism. The creature did not try to force the door open or break the glass. It simply stood there, patiently testing the lock, while the stolen voices continued to murmur endlessly from the surrounding darkness. The final page of the unredacted logbook contained only a few hurried sentences logged at 3:43 a.m. The handwriting had devolved into a frantic, nearly illegible scrawl. The observer noted that the deep structural groaning of the tower had returned, but this time it was coming from all four sides simultaneously. There was not just one of them waiting outside. The wet clicking filled the air, vibrating violently through the floorboards beneath his boots. The final sentence on the page was heavily underlined. It simply read, "They know the glass is fragile, they are tapping the panes." When the scheduled relief crew arrived 2 days later, the Black Mountain Tower was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, the furniture was undisturbed, and no trace of blood or damage was found inside the cabin. The heavy wooden trapdoor was still securely locked from the inside, meaning whoever left had not used the stairs. The glass windows were entirely intact, but the relief crew noted they were covered in an oily, translucent residue on the outside, spanning from the floor to the roofline. The Forestry Service never publicly identified the substance. The observer's personal belongings, including his keys and wallet, were still neatly packed in his duffel bag beneath the cot. The official report filed by the agency later that month stated that the young man had simply walked off the job, abandoning his post to hike back to civilization due to severe isolation fatigue. The unredacted logbook pages remained buried in classified archives until a Freedom of Information request accidentally uncovered them nearly 2 decades later. The Forestry Service immediately issued a brief statement dismissing the handwritten pages as a creative writing exercise, claiming they were merely a symptom of the observer's declining mental state during his long deployment. But former rangers who worked the Black Mountain District during that era have long shared quiet rumors about the events of that summer. They frequently point out that the fire tower was permanently decommissioned and completely dismantled just 3 weeks after the disappearance, an expensive and unusual procedure for a fully functional structure. And local hikers still whisper about certain windless nights deep in the Clearwater Forest when the woods fall dead silent, and the trees seem to echo with the faint sound of a hollow, lifeless voice endlessly asking for a status check. The Beast of Bray Road's Gaze. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over the rural farmlands of Walworth County, Wisconsin, when the autumn harvest is done. It is not a peaceful quiet. It is a heavy, expectant stillness, broken only by the dry rustle of dead corn stalks swaying in the night wind. Out here, beyond the reach of city streetlights, the darkness is absolute. The only geometry is the straight, paved line of county highways cutting through the endless fields. For decades, the locals of Elkhorn have understood that when the fog rolls in off the fields, something else claims the night. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred in the atmosphere of this quiet dairy community. It began as hushed conversations in the back booths of local diners, a farmer reporting an unnervingly large canine tearing into a chicken wire fence, a teenager claiming a monster chased her car down a dark stretch of gravel. At first, it was easy to dismiss these accounts as the products of overactive imaginations or too much cheap beer, but then the witnesses began to change. Reasonable, grounded individuals started coming forward. A local journalist began compiling these scattered reports, realizing they all shared chillingly specific details. Even off-duty police officers and seasoned hunters admitted to seeing something out on the lonely stretches of asphalt that defied natural explanation. They called it the Beast of Bray Road. The descriptions were terrifyingly consistent. It was not a wolf, nor was it a bear. Witnesses spoke of a creature with dark, matted fur, a broad chest, and a snout resembling a canine, yet it possessed an anatomy that allowed it to kneel, grasp, and move with a sickeningly human grace. The local lore did not paint a picture of a phantom or a ghost. It painted a picture of flesh, bone, and muscle. It was an apex predator, existing quietly in the peripheral vision of the modern world, only stepping into the light when it chose to. The true horror of Bray Road does not rely on folklore. It relies on the primal vulnerability of being utterly alone in the dark. It is a vulnerability understood entirely by those who find themselves navigating the dense, freezing fog that blankets the Wisconsin flatlands deep in the early hours of the morning. It is nearing 2:15 a.m. The air outside is cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost on the skeletal branches of the oak trees lining the roadside. A solitary car moves along the blacktop, its tires hissing against the damp asphalt. Inside, a woman grips the steering wheel, her eyes straining against the thick gray soup that reduces her visibility to a mere 20 yards. The high beams of her headlights are practically useless, reflecting off the water droplets in the air and creating a blinding white wall. She drops to her low beams, her speed decelerating to a cautious crawl. There is no radio signal out here, only the low, steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers cutting through the mist. The isolation is total. If the engine were to stall, the nearest farmhouse is miles away, its occupants long since asleep. In this enclosed space, surrounded by the vast, unseen wilderness, the car feels less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile metal cage. Up ahead, on the right shoulder of the road, a shadow bleeds through the fog. At first, it is just an indistinct mass, darker than the surrounding night. The driver taps her brakes, anticipating a stray deer or perhaps a neighbor's loose cow. As the car inches closer, the headlights begin to carve out the shape of the obstruction. It is not a cow. It is an enormous, dark figure crouched low to the ground, positioned over the mangled remains of a freshly killed white-tailed deer. The driver brings the vehicle to a complete halt, her foot pressing firmly against the brake pedal. The engine idles loudly in the dead quiet of the night. Through the glass, illuminated by the twin beams of the halogen headlights, the scene unfolds with horrifying clarity. The creature's back is turned to the car. Thick, coarse fur, the color of wet ash and charcoal, covers a torso that is impossibly broad. Heavy muscles ripple beneath its coat as it tears into the carcass. The sound is muffled by the closed windows, but the violent, jerky movements of the creature's head leave no doubt as to what it is doing. Large, clawed hands, bearing a sickening resemblance to human fingers, grip the deer's ribcage to hold it steady. A rational mind desperately searches for a comforting explanation. It must be a grizzly bear that wandered hundreds of miles out of its territory, or an abnormally large mutated wolf. But the proportions are entirely wrong. The shoulders are tapered like a weightlifter's, the arms too long and heavily articulated. A cold, heavy knot of dread tightens in the driver's stomach. Her breath hitches, clouding the cold glass of her side window. She knows she should press the accelerator and speed past, but her body is paralyzed by a deeply ingrained ancestral terror. She is a witness to something that should not exist. Then, the creature registers the presence of the car. It stops feeding. The sudden stillness is worse than the violent movement. The beast drops a torn piece of flesh onto the damp asphalt. Slowly, with a deliberate and terrifying grace, it begins to rise. It does not stay on all fours like a startled animal preparing to flee. Instead, it pushes off the ground, its powerful hind legs straightening. The joints pop and crack with sickening volume, audible even over the idling engine. The creature unfolds itself, rising up and up, towering over the hood of the car. It stands firmly on two legs, reaching a height of well over 7 feet. Its sheer mass blocks out the white line painted on the edge of the road. The beast turns its head to face the vehicle. The headlights illuminate a terrifying visage. A long, dark snout, drawn back in a subtle sneer, reveals teeth stained crimson with fresh blood. Pointed ears sit high on a lupine skull, but the true nightmare lies in its eyes. They are a luminescent, pale amber, catching the artificial light and reflecting it back into the fog. The horror of the moment does not stem from a roar or a feral lunge toward the glass. The monster does not act like a cornered beast running on blind instinct. Instead, it simply stares. It stares through the windshield, past the glare of the headlights, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the woman behind the wheel. The gaze is calculating. It is an expression of deep, predatory intelligence. The creature recognizes the metal machine for what it is, and more importantly, it recognizes the soft, fragile human trapped inside it. There is a silent communication in that unblinking stare, an understanding of absolute dominance. It is deciding, in real time, whether to let her live. Time loses all meaning in the heavy, suffocating silence. The beast's chest rises and falls with deep, measured breaths. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the creature dismisses her. It turns its massive shoulders away from the light, takes one long, fluid step over the guardrail, and melts seamlessly into the dense, fog-choked woods. The darkness swallows it whole, leaving only the mutilated remains of the deer on the shoulder as proof that the encounter was not a hallucination. The driver slams her foot onto the gas pedal, the tires screech against the pavement, struggling for traction before launching the car forward into the night. She does not look in the rearview mirror. She drives until the fuel tank is nearly empty, long after the rural roads have given way to the safety of sodium streetlights and civilization. The Elkhorn police logs from those years are filled with similar reports. Stunned drivers stumbling into the station, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they try to describe a nightmare that walked on two legs. Skeptics continue to write off the Bray Road beast as misidentified bears, large dogs, or a mass sociological delusion. But those who have driven down that isolated stretch of blacktop in the dead of night know the truth. They know that when the fog rolls in and the temperature drops, the woods harbor ancient, intelligent predators. And they know that if you find yourself stopped on the edge of a cornfield, caught in the pale glow of amber eyes, your survival is entirely dependent on a monster's mercy. Attacked at the Sally House. The limestone walls of Atchison, Kansas hold a coldness that the prairie sun cannot reach. In this small town where the Missouri River winds like a slow, dark ribbon, stands a modest brick house on North 2nd Street. To a passing stranger, it looks like a relic of the late 19th century, sturdy, unassuming, and quiet. But the air around the property feels heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by the weight of a 100-year-old secret. Inside, the shadows do not behave according to the laws of light. They cling to the corners of the ceiling, and they watch. They are waiting for a specific kind of guest. They are waiting for the men. The legend of the Sally House is not one of a vengeful widow or a spectral soldier, but of a child. According to the documented lore of the town, the haunting traces back to a young girl named Sally who died on the operating table in the front room of this very house. In the early 1900s, the home served as the residence and office of a local physician. Sally was brought there by her frantic mother, suffering from a severe case of appendicitis. The doctor, fearing the organ would rupture, did not wait for the anesthesia to take full effect. Sally's final moments in the world of the living were defined by the cold bite of a scalpel and a blinding, white-hot agony. She died believing the man trying to save her was the man who was torturing her. For decades, the house remained relatively quiet, a slumbering vessel for a trauma that refused to dissipate. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the house truly woke up. A young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved into the residence, unaware that they were stepping into a territorial battleground. From the very first night, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature would plummet in the nursery, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Strange smells, the metallic scent of blood, and the sterile odor of old medicine would waft through the hallways. But the entity in the house wasn't interested in Deborah. It had fixed its sights on Tony. The escalation began with subtle pranks. Objects would move across the kitchen table when Tony was alone. He would hear the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet running across the floorboards upstairs, followed by a giggle that sounded less like a child and more like a warning. Then came the physical contact. It started as a phantom touch, a cold hand brushing against his neck in the middle of the night. But as the weeks passed, the touch turned violent. The spirit of the little girl, or whatever was masquerading as her, began to manifest a visceral, burning hatred for the man of the house. During one dinner, while friends were visiting, Tony felt a sharp, stinging sensation across his back. He pulled up his shirt to reveal 3 long, bright red welts, as if a small hand with jagged nails had raked across his skin. There was no explanation. He hadn't been near anything sharp. The marks were fresh, weeping, and hot to the touch. This became the Sally house's signature. It was no longer a haunting of sightings and sounds. It was a haunting of physical assault. The entity was marking him, claiming his flesh as a canvas for its eternal resentment of the doctor who had failed it. One evening, at approximately 10:15 p.m., the activity reached a terrifying crescendo. Tony was in the basement, a dark, damp space with a dirt floor that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. The air down there was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. He felt a sudden, oppressive pressure on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He tried to turn back toward the stairs, but his feet felt heavy, as if he were walking through waist-deep water. Then, the burning started. It wasn't just a scratch this time. It felt like someone had pressed a branding iron against his torso. He cried out, stumbling toward the light of the kitchen above. When he reached the safety of the living room and lifted his shirt, his wife gasped. Across his chest were dozens of scratches, crisscrossing in a chaotic pattern. Some were thin and shallow, while others were deep enough to bead with blood. They formed a frantic, angry map of pain. As they watched, new marks began to appear in real time, appearing under the skin like invisible ink being heated by a flame. There was no one near him. The room was empty of anyone living, yet Tony was being shredded by unseen fingers. The horror angle of the Sally house is the realization that the entity isn't just a confused child. Investigators who have spent nights in the house describe a dual presence. There is the girl, Sally, who is often seen in a pinafore dress clutching a teddy bear, but behind her, or perhaps using her image as a mask, is something much older and more sinister. This darker force thrives on the fear of men. It watches from the top of the stairs, a shadow taller than any man, with eyes that do not reflect light. When male visitors enter the nursery, they often report a feeling of intense nausea, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that wants to tear the skin from their bones. One investigator in the mid-90s recounted a session at 3 a.m. in the nursery. He sat in the center of the room with a tape recorder, asking questions into the silence. He felt a sudden, icy breeze pass through his hair. He joked nervously about the cold, trying to maintain his composure. Within seconds, he felt a violent shove against his shoulder that nearly knocked him off his chair. When he looked at his arm, he found a circular bruise already forming, the size of a small child's palm, but with a strength that suggested a muscular, adult force. The audio recording from that night captured a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce, followed by a child's voice whispering a single word, "Get out." The house has a way of isolating its victims. Even when the room is full of people, the man being targeted feels as though he is in a void. The sounds of the outside world, the cars on North 2nd Street, the wind in the trees fade into a muffled hum. All that remains is the sound of his own heartbeat and the realization that he is being hunted in a space that should be a sanctuary. The scratches often appear in sets of 3, a mockery of the Holy Trinity that is common in demonic hauntings, suggesting that the little girl may be a facade for something far more predatory. By the time the Pickmans finally fled the house, Tony's body was a map of scars. He had suffered over 20 documented physical attacks. The scratches would often heal with unnatural speed, disappearing within 24 hours, only to be replaced by new ones the moment he stepped back across the threshold. The psychological toll was even greater. He began to have dreams of the operating table, feeling the phantom slice of the doctor's knife, experiencing the terror of a child who realizes the person meant to help them is the one causing the pain. Today, the Sally House remains a site of pilgrimage for those who wish to test their bravery, but the warnings remain unchanged. Women and children often walk through the rooms with nothing more than a slight chill or a sense of sadness. But for the men who dare to enter, the experience is different. They speak of a lingering dread that follows them home, a feeling of being marked. Some have reported finding scratches on their backs days after leaving Atchison, as if the entity had hitched a ride, waiting until they were vulnerable in their own beds to remind them of its presence. The house stands silent now, its dark windows reflecting the Kansas sky, but if you stand on the sidewalk long enough after the sun goes down, you might see a small shadow move past the upstairs window. You might hear the faint sound of a girl crying, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of something much larger pacing the floorboards. The limestone walls remember the screams of 1906, and the entity inside remembers the face of every man who has ever entered its domain. It is a house that does not forgive, and it is a house that never forgets the feel of skin beneath its claws. A Dartmoor report described a voice that matched his wife. Exactly. It was 2:15 in the morning when the man stood completely still in his dark kitchen, listening to his wife call for help from the edge of the woods. Her voice was trembling, cutting through the dense fog that rolled off the tree line, begging him to open the back door. The sound was distinct and terrified, carrying the exact pitch and slight rasp she always had when she was frightened. But he did not reach for the deadbolt. He kept his hand pressed flat against the cold wood of the doorframe, his breathing shallow, because he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of his actual wife drifting down the stairs from their second-floor bedroom. The property sat at the end of a long, unpaved gravel road in Dartmoor County, a deeply rural stretch of the Pacific Northwest known for its oppressive weather and vast, unbroken tracts of pine forest. According to local records, the area had always struggled with a spotty telephone network and a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. Sound traveled strangely across the damp valleys. A falling tree could sound like a gunshot, and the wind moving through the ravines often mimicked the drone of a low-flying airplane. But the voice filtering through the glass of the kitchen door was not a trick of the wind, it was a precise, flawless replication of a human voice layered with artificial emotion. The man, whose name was detailed in later police reports only as Thomas, remained in the dark. Outside, the pleading continued. The voice repeated the same 3 phrases in a loop. It asked him to come outside, it said it was cold, it said it had lost the flashlight. Thomas realized with a sinking sickness that these were the exact phrases his wife had used 3 years earlier during a camping trip in another state when she had briefly lost her way near their tent. The cadence was perfectly preserved, like an audio recording pressed into the damp night air. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off abruptly without any natural fade or intake of breath. Thomas pressed his cheek against the frosted glass of the back window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. There was no movement near the tree line. The motion sensor light attached to the garage, which was sensitive enough to trigger when a stray deer wandered past, remained completely dark. Yet, he could hear the unmistakable sound of wet leaves compressing under heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving closer to the house, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It sounded like something walking on two legs, but the steps were spaced too far apart, dragging slightly with every second stride. According to the incident report filed days later, Thomas finally backed away from the door and retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. He did not turn it on. He moved silently through the first floor, checking the locks on the heavy oak front door and the sliding glass panels in the living room. Every window was secured. As he stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent room, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass of the living room window. Thomas froze. The window was located on the side of the house where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. To reach that glass from the outside, a person would need to be standing on a tall ladder, or they would have to be nearly 9 feet tall. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer screaming, it was whispering right against the external pane of glass. It whispered Thomas's name over and over, mirroring the gentle, sleepy tone his wife used when waking him up in the morning. The history of Dartmoor County is scattered with strange, fragmented reports of auditory anomalies. Archival newspaper clippings from the 1970s describe loggers walking off their job sites, claiming they heard their foreman calling them into deep, unmarked sections of the forest. In 1992, a search and rescue team spent 3 days looking for a missing hiker because they kept hearing his voice echoing from the bottom of a limestone gorge. When they finally found the man, he had been deceased for over 48 hours, making it medically impossible for him to have been shouting for help that morning. These incidents were often rationalized as echo delays or the stress-induced auditory hallucinations of exhausted searchers. But standing in his living room, Thomas knew he was not hallucinating. The whisper against the glass was too tactile, too physically present. The condensation on the outside of the window seemed to blur, disturbed by hot breath. Slowly, Thomas raised the heavy flashlight and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the window. The bright circle of light illuminated the swirling fog and the bare branches of an oak tree. There was nothing standing outside the glass. The air was empty. But the whispering did not stop. It simply shifted, the source of the sound moving rapidly along the exterior wall, traveling faster than a human could run. The voice slid along the vinyl siding, moving toward the front porch. Thomas tracked the sound from the inside, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard the wooden planks of the porch groan under a sudden, immense weight. Then came the sound of the front door handle jiggling. It was a violent, frantic rattling, as if someone was desperately trying to force the lock. Thomas raised the flashlight like a weapon, bracing himself. Over the noise of the rattling handle, a new voice spoke. It was deep, panicked, and distinctly male. It was his own voice. The voice outside the door was screaming to let him in. It was a flawless imitation of Thomas shouting for his wife, demanding she unlock the door and call 911. Thomas listened to himself panic. He listened to the exact timbre of his own terror, a terror he was currently feeling but had not yet voiced aloud. The mimicry was so uncanny that for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thomas felt a severe detachment from his own body. He wondered wildly if he was the one trapped outside in the freezing fog, and the thing standing inside the dark hallway was the imposter. Up on the second floor, a floorboard creaked. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzing trance. The noise outside the front door vanished instantly, plunging the house back into suffocating silence. He heard his wife's footsteps moving slowly down the carpeted stairs. She called out his name, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. Thomas immediately warned her to stay back, to stay on the stairs. He kept his flashlight trained on the front door, the solid wood suddenly looking very fragile. She asked him what was going on, why he was standing in the dark. He did not know how to explain that he had just spent 20 minutes listening to both of them beg for their lives from the other side of the walls. They sat together on the floor of the upstairs hallway until dawn, the bedroom door locked, waiting for the sun to burn off the fog. The local police arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 deputies walked the perimeter of the house while Thomas and his wife watched from the kitchen window. The officers found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the glass was undisturbed, and the motion sensor lights were confirmed to be in perfect working order. However, the official police report noted one peculiar detail that the deputies could not easily dismiss. In the damp soil beneath the living room window, the window that overlooked the steep drop-off into the ravine, there were deep impressions in the mud. They were not footprints, they were long, smooth drag marks, as if something incredibly heavy and completely lacking limbs had pulled itself back and forth beneath the glass. The marks stretched all the way around the foundation of the house, leading up the steps to the front porch, and eventually disappearing into the thick brush at the edge of the tree line. Desperate for proof that they were not losing their grip on reality, Thomas purchased a digital audio recorder from an electronics store 50 miles away. He placed it on the wooden railing of the front porch, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the creeping dampness of the fog. He set it to activate only when it detected a sound louder than a whisper. For 3 nights, the device captured nothing but the low hum of the wind and the occasional patter of freezing rain against the wooden deck. On the 4th morning, the digital display indicated that 42 minutes of audio had been recorded between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and his wife sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, the distinct crunch of gravel. Something heavy was dragging itself up the driveway. The sound was wet, accompanied by a low, rhythmic wheezing that did not sound remotely biological. Then, the voices began. It was not just Thomas and his wife. The recorder had captured a chaotic, layered chorus of conversations. They heard a mail carrier they had spoken to weeks ago asking about a stray dog. They heard a neighbor complaining about a fallen tree. They heard the 911 dispatcher from the night of the first incident repeating her calm, practiced instructions on a loop. The entity outside was practicing. It was sifting through an archive of stolen sounds, testing syllables, adjusting its pitch, searching for the frequency that would compel someone to unlock the door. The most disturbing part of the recording came at the very end. The layered voices abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, dead silence. Then, a voice spoke directly into the microphone. It was impossibly close, the breathing heavily distorted by the plastic bag. It was the voice of Thomas's wife, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was a melody she only ever hummed while she was completely alone, folding laundry in the basement. The entity had been listening to them long before it ever made itself known. The illusion of safety shattered permanently on a Tuesday evening in late November. The sun had set early, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Thomas's wife was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Thomas was in the basement organizing a set of tools. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space of exposed concrete and damp earth, lit by a single bulb swinging from a wire. As he sorted through a box of nails, he heard her call down the wooden stairs. She asked him to come up and look at something outside the window. Her voice was calm, casual, lacking any trace of alarm. Thomas dropped a handful of nails back into the box and began walking toward the staircase. He had his foot on the bottom step when his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from his wife. It read that she had just driven into town to pick up milk from the grocery store and would be back in 20 minutes. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. From the top of the dark staircase, the voice spoke again. It repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same casual intonation. It asked him to come up and look at something outside. Thomas did not answer. He slowly backed away from the stairs, retreating into the shadows of the concrete walls. He realized that the voice was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the narrow gap beneath the door at the top of the stairs, vibrating through the wood with an unnatural, mechanical precision. He stood in the damp darkness for what felt like hours, gripping a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Above him, the pacing began. It was not the sound of dragging, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots walking across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. The footsteps matched Thomas's own gait perfectly. He listened as the entity moved through their home, opening cabinets, running the faucet, mimicking the mundane sounds of a quiet evening. It was playing house. It was wearing their routine like a stolen piece of clothing. When the headlights of his wife's car finally swept across the driveway, the footsteps above him abruptly stopped. Thomas heard the front door open, heard his wife calling out a greeting, the rustle of paper grocery bags being set on the counter. He waited for another voice to answer her. He waited for a scream, but there was only silence, followed by her footsteps walking toward the basement door. She opened it and called down, asking why he was sitting in the dark. Her voice was real. The air in the house had returned to normal. They moved out of Dartmoor County exactly 4 days later. They broke their lease, packed only what could fit in the back of their vehicle, and left the heavy furniture behind. They never returned to collect the rest. The property sat vacant for years, slowly being reclaimed by the aggressive overgrowth of the Pacific Northwest. The windows became clouded with grime, and the roof eventually sagged under the weight of accumulated pine needles. But the legend of the Dartmoor mimic remains a quietly discussed topic among the locals who live near the state forest. Hikers are strictly advised to stay on marked trails and to never venture into the woods alone. The warning is not just for the risk of getting lost or encountering wildlife, it is because of the reports that still occasionally surface at the local ranger station. Reports of hikers hearing their own names called from the bottom of deep ravines, reports of missing campers whose voices are heard crying out in the fog, weeks after the search operations have been officially suspended. There is one detail from Thomas's final police report that locals rarely mention to outsiders. When he finally walked upstairs that night, after his wife had returned from the store, he noticed something resting on the kitchen counter. Next to the paper grocery bags was the heavy steel flashlight he had used during the first incident weeks prior. He had left it on his bedside table that morning, but there it sat, perfectly centered on the counter, still cold to the touch. The entity had not just mimicked their voices, it had left a quiet, mocking proof that it had been inside all along, watching them learn how to be afraid. An Ontario forest camera captured something after midnight. The sequence of photographs began at 2:14 in the morning. David sat alone at his small kitchen table, the pale glow of the laptop screen casting long, distorted shadows across the empty room as he slowly clicked through the silent captures from trail camera number 4. The first 3 images showed nothing but the dark, freezing timber of the provincial wilderness, illuminated only by the harsh, flat burst of the infrared flash. But the 4th image, time-stamped 2:17 a.m., contained a pale, smeared blur at the extreme edge of the tree line. It was tall, far too tall to be a wolf or a roaming black bear, and its shape did not make geometric sense in the context of the dense, tangled brush. David was a field biologist studying seasonal migration patterns deep in the sprawling, unbroken forests of northern Ontario. It was a profoundly lonely profession, one that required long, uninterrupted stretches of isolation in a rudimentary cabin located 50 miles from the nearest paved road. The surrounding landscape was a vast, unforgiving ocean of black spruce, cedar, and birch, a place where the deep winter cold could snap a dry branch with the echoing sound of a rifle shot. To monitor the wildlife without disturbing them, David relied on a wide network of 30 motion-activated trail cameras, heavily strapped to tree trunks along natural game trails and frozen creeks. Camera number 4 was his most remote station. It was located 3 miles deep into a heavily wooded valley that the older locals and indigenous guides simply called the Black Ridge. It was a notoriously quiet patch of timber. According to regional historical records, a commercial logging company had attempted to clear the ridge in 1922, but they completely abandoned the camp after only 2 months. The official reports cited logistical failures and severe, unpredictable weather, but rumors persisted for decades that the lumberjacks simply refused to work in the deep shadows of those particular trees. They claimed the woods were unnatural, entirely devoid of animal sounds, and that their heavy equipment was constantly being dragged or moved in the middle of the night. David had never paid much attention to local folklore. He was a man of strict science, relying entirely on data, timestamps, and observable facts. When he had hiked out to retrieve the memory card from the Black Ridge earlier that afternoon, the heavy plastic casing of the camera had been covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of frost. It had sat in the silent woods, untouched by human hands, for 4 long weeks. Now, sitting alone in his locked cabin, with the diesel generator humming softly outside and the freezing wind picking up off the surface of the frozen lake, the digital data he was observing was beginning to defy all scientific logic. He clicked to the next photograph. The timestamp read 2:18 a.m. The pale blur had moved closer to the center of the frame. It was entirely motionless in the frozen capture, yet it was distinctly closer to the lens. The camera's infrared sensor rendered everything in stark, ghostly shades of gray, black, and white, and whatever this entity was, it reflected the invisible flash with an unnatural, sickening intensity. It looked like a towering figure wrapped in something damp and ragged, or perhaps something that had no clear defining physical edges. Its limbs, if they could accurately be called limbs, seemed terribly long, bending at subtle, wrong angles that defied the natural mechanics of bone and joint. David zoomed in on the image, leaning closer to the monitor, watching the pixels dissolve into grainy white noise. A cold, prickling sensation crept slowly up the back of his neck. He glanced up from the screen, his eyes darting toward the cabin window. Beyond the thick glass, the night was absolute, suffocating black. He suddenly felt acutely aware of exactly how far he was from any other living human being. If he were to scream, the sound would simply be swallowed by the millions of silent trees surrounding him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, forced his eyes back to the glowing screen, and pressed the right arrow key. According to the digital data embedded in the image files, the motion sensor was being triggered precisely every 60 seconds. A passing deer, a lynx, or even a wandering moose would have walked through the narrow frame and vanished into the brush within moments. But this presence was intentionally lingering. It was deliberately staying within the camera's narrow field of view. He clicked forward. 2:19 a.m., 2:20 a.m., 2:21 a.m. In each successive photograph, the pale figure shifted slightly, inching agonizingly closer to the hidden lens. The movement was entirely linear, a slow, methodical approach entirely devoid of the erratic, nervous caution of a wild animal. By 2:24 a.m., the pale mass occupied the entire left half of the image. The face, if it possessed a face, was completely obscured by a smooth, featureless stretch of pale, tightly stretched gray. There were no reflective eyes catching the infrared light, no snout, no visible ears. Yet, the overall posture of the towering thing suggested a terrifyingly intense focus. It was looking directly down into the lens. It was observing the small, blinking red light of the motion sensor just as intently as the camera was observing it. The wind outside his cabin began to howl through the eaves, rattling the loose pane of glass in the living room window with a rapid, violent shaking. David paused his clicking, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He listened to the bitter draft whistling through the log walls, a sound he had heard 1,000 times before, but tonight it sounded hollow, almost mournful in the dark. The cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the room popped loudly, making his shoulders jump. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying desperately to rationalize what he was looking at. He told himself it was a technical artifact of the Flash, a trick of falling snow and deep shadows, a piece of birch bark caught in a spiderweb directly in front of the lens. He looked back at the screen. The timestamp on the next file was 2:30 a.m. A gap of exactly 6 minutes had passed where the camera had captured absolutely nothing. He hesitated for a long moment before pressing the key. The image captured at 2:30 a.m. was almost entirely blinding white. At first, David thought the camera had finally malfunctioned, completely blinded by a sudden flurry of heavy snow reflecting the intense flash. But as his eyes slowly adjusted to the harsh contrast, his breath caught sharply in his throat. He realized the white mass filling the screen was the actual surface of the thing itself. It was standing mere inches from the camera lens. The physical texture of it was entirely wrong. It did not look like rough fabric, nor did it look like thick animal fur. It looked like stretched, damp parchment, pulled agonizingly tight over an unseen, shifting frame. Near the upper right corner of the frame, there was a dark, cavernous void, a jagged, asymmetrical tear in the pale mass that faintly resembled a hollow, silently screaming mouth. And behind that terrible void, the dark outline of the familiar pine trees was completely blocked out. The entity was massive. It was entirely suffocating the camera. David pushed his wooden chair heavily back from the table. The scraping sound across the floorboards echoed far too loudly in the silent, empty cabin. He stood up, pacing the small confines of the kitchen, his heart hammering rhythmically against his ribs. He tried to build a logical, scientific explanation. Perhaps a large white owl had swooped down and temporarily covered the lens with its massive wing. Perhaps a wandering moose had pressed its wet nose directly against the plastic casing. He repeated these logical scenarios in his mind, trying to anchor himself firmly to reality, but the logic felt incredibly fragile. An owl would not have taken 16 minutes to slowly approach the camera from the distant tree line. A moose would have triggered the sensitive motion sensor with its massive bulk long before it ever reached the lens. He forced himself to sit back down in the wooden chair. There were still 22 unread photos left in the designated computer folder. He took a slow, shaky breath and pressed the arrow key. 2:31 a.m. The lens was perfectly clear again. The pale, suffocating figure was entirely gone. The forest looked perfectly normal. An empty, mundane corridor of dark evergreens standing silent in the freezing night. David let out a long, heavy breath, feeling a sudden, rushing wave of profound relief wash over him. It was gone. Whatever the anomaly was, it had finally moved on. He clicked to the next image, expecting to see nothing but empty, static woods until dawn. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m. The woods were indeed still empty. But there was a single, terrifying detail in the lower right corner of the frame that immediately caught his attention. It was a fresh footprint pressed deep into the light dusting of snow on the forest floor. In the previous clear image, the snow had been completely undisturbed. Now there was a deep, elongated impression. It was far too long and wide to be a human boot, and it possessed no distinct toes, claws, or animal pads. It was simply a heavy, crushing, dragging mark that smeared roughly through the frost, deeply exposing the dark earth beneath. He clicked rapidly through the next 15 photos. 2:35 a.m., 2:40 a.m., 2:45 a.m., 2:52 a.m. The woods remained entirely empty. The single footprint remained perfectly untouched by wind or fresh snow. Yet, the camera continued to trigger. It fired its silent flash into the absolute void of the forest over and over again, capturing nothing but static trees and that single, strange track. This slow realization chilled David to his absolute core. If the camera was entirely motion-activated, something heavy and substantial was still moving out there in the dark. It was either moving far too fast for the digital shutter to capture, or it was moving just outside the narrow cone of the camera's vision, pacing endlessly back and forth in the blind spots. As David reached the very end of the digital folder, he noticed a deeply unsettling pattern in the timestamps of the final 5 photographs. They were no longer being triggered minutes apart. They were triggering mere seconds apart, as if the sensor was being completely overwhelmed by frantic, rapid motion. 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock and 12 seconds, 3 o'clock and 25 seconds. He cycled through them, the images flashing rapidly on his screen like a crude, disjointed stop-motion film. In the first 3 images, the forest was perfectly still and empty. But in the 4th image, captured at exactly 3 o'clock and 38 seconds, The entire perspective of the camera had violently shifted. The lens was no longer pointing straight down the frozen game trail. It was pointing directly upward into the dense, tangled canopy of the dark trees. The heavy canvas strap used to secure the camera to the trunk, a thick woven band rated for hundreds of pounds of pressure, had been snapped with incredible, sudden force. The final photograph in the folder, taken at 3:40, was captured while the camera was in a chaotic state of freefall. It was a blurry, deeply disorienting smear of dark branches, falling snow, and pitch-black sky. But in the very center of that chaotic blur, illuminated briefly by the dying burst of the flash, was an incredibly long, pale, multi-jointed appendage reaching straight down from the high branches above. It bent back upon itself in a sickening, impossible geometry, its surface perfectly matching the damp parchment texture of the pale mass from earlier. It was reaching down through the air, grasping blindly toward the falling camera. David did not sleep a single minute that night. He sat frozen at his kitchen table until the dull, gray light of a winter dawn finally crept slowly through the frosted windows, his tired eyes fixed, unblinking, on that final, blurry image. When the winter sun was fully above the tree line, he packed a heavy rifle, loaded his truck, and drove the 3 miles down the rutted, icy logging road. He parked at the dead end and hiked the final mile into the Black Ridge section on foot, determined to retrieve his broken equipment and prove to himself that this was all an elaborate prank by local hunters or a bizarre mechanical failure. When he finally located the specific pine tree where camera number 4 had been mounted, the torn remnants of the canvas strap were still dangling loosely from the rough bark, its thick edges violently frayed and torn. The heavy, reinforced plastic casing of the camera lay shattered into a dozen jagged pieces on the frozen, unforgiving ground. The small alkaline batteries were scattered in the white snow, completely drained of all their power. He gathered the broken pieces of plastic in complete silence, his gloved hand gripping the leather strap of his rifle tightly, his eyes constantly scanning the dense, overarching canopy of heavy pine branches above his head. The woods around him were utterly, unnaturally silent. There were no winter birds calling in the distance, no wind whistling through the dry needles, no sound of small animals scurrying through the dead underbrush. It felt like standing completely still inside a vacuum. As he finally turned to leave the ridge, eager to get back to the safety and warmth of his truck, he looked down at the wide base of the massive pine tree. The morning sun had melted some of the lighter frost, but in the damp, exposed earth around the thick roots, he found a continuous, unbroken series of those deep, dragged impressions. They did not lead away into the deeper forest, nor did they lead back toward the established game trail. The massive, dragging tracks circled the base of the tree, over and over again, trampling the loose soil into a dark, muddy, chaotic ring before simply stopping directly beneath the thickest, highest branches. According to provincial employment records, David never returned to the Black Ridge area, nor did he ever finish his research contract. He submitted his seasonal ecological report a full month early, packed up his remote cabin in a single afternoon, and relocated to a completely different wildlife reserve over 400 miles away. The memory card containing the late-night infrared images was reportedly locked away in a private safety deposit box, never published in any of his official surveys, and never shown to his academic colleagues. To this day, local hunters and brave hikers who venture too far into the deep, silent timber of northern Ontario sometimes report finding strange, deep tracks circling the base of the oldest trees. And in the small, isolated logging towns bordering the vast wilderness, a quiet, persistent rumor still survives among those who spend their lives in the woods. They say that if you leave a camera out in the deep timber overnight, you should never review the footage taken between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Because whatever slowly wanders the Black Ridge at that hour is learning exactly how the blinking cameras work, and it does not like being watched. The case that was closed too quickly in Ohio. By the time the deputy reached the gravel pull-off above the creek, The flashlight beams were already moving over the reeds, and someone down in the dark was saying that the girl had been found on her back, not face down, and that her coat was folded beside her as if she had stopped there willingly. Before sunrise, that detail would begin to disappear. By noon, it would be gone from the official version entirely. The town sat low in the southern hills of Ohio, in that part of the state where the roads bent around old mines, churchyards, and patches of woods that never seemed to thin, even in winter. People there remembered sounds more than dates. A train at midnight, dogs barking toward the river, a screen door opening where no one should have been. The investigation began in one of those cold months when the fields turned colorless and every yard looked abandoned after dusk. She was in her early 20s, according to the reports that circulated first, and she had last been seen leaving a roadside place just outside town after the late shift. The usual pieces appeared quickly. A car left where it should not have been, a phone that stopped answering, a family that began calling before the county was ready to call it an emergency. Early newspaper accounts, the kind written fast and half from rumor, described a scene that did not match the conclusion that came later. One article mentioned marks on the slope above the creek, as if something heavy had been dragged through the frosted grass. Another said the first officer on scene believed there had been more than one person there. A radio bulletin, repeated for less than a day and then never again, stated that the body had been located several yards from the waterline, not in it, and that the victim's shoes were unusually clean for someone who had slipped down a muddy bank in the dark. Those reports were not formal evidence. They were only early fragments gathered in haste, but in small towns, the first version of an event leaves a stain. It does not wash out easily. The official explanation settled over everything with surprising speed. It was not dramatic, that was part of its strength. She had become disoriented, the public was told. There was poor visibility. The creek had risen. Exposure and water had done the rest. There was no confirmed sign of assault, no confirmed sign of abduction, no clear reason to keep the county awake much longer than it already had been. What had begun as a tense search narrowed into paperwork, then signatures, then silence. People who had spent the first day whispering in parking lots stopped whispering, not because the questions had been answered, but because the answer had already been chosen. And yet, the first detective assigned to the file did not seem convinced, at least not at once. Years later, when portions of the case papers were discussed by local researchers and former reporters, certain details stood out for the way they resisted the final summary. There was a notation about a back door in a nearby vacant property being found unlatched. There was mention of a broken drinking glass on a kitchen floor inside that same structure, despite no public statement ever linking the girl to the building. There was also a line, brief and badly typed, recording that a witness on the Ridge Road had heard a vehicle idling there sometime after midnight, long after the restaurants and gas stations had gone dark. That witness later seemed to vanish from the public record altogether. The vacant property became the part of the story that older residents still lowered their voices over. It was not a notorious place, only an old house left to weather at the edge of a field, with one leaning porch post and a front room that took on the smell of wet plaster every autumn. Teenagers had gone there now and then, hunters cut across the back lot. Nothing about it suggested a legend, at least not before the investigation touched it. But according to people who later claimed to have seen the early scene notes, there had been signs of recent movement inside. Mud on one stretch of floorboards and nowhere else. A chair pulled toward the window facing the road, a coat button that did not match the victim's clothes. Most troubling of all was a short sentence in an evidence inventory that referred to audio material recovered from rear bedroom. No description followed it. No transcript was attached. In the final case packet, that item was no longer there. Those omissions might have been clerical. Papers are misplaced, inventories are corrected, small departments are not always careful in the first frantic hours of a case. But the pattern ran deeper than a single missing item. A local reporter who kept copies of the earliest clippings noticed that the location of the body shifted from one account to the next. In one version, she had been found near the water, as though she had stumbled. In another, she had been found in a shallow depression above the bank where the frost had not yet melted around her hair. One report said her hands were bare, another said one glove was tucked into the pocket of her coat. The coat itself moved through the story in an even stranger way: folded, torn, missing, recovered later. There was never one stable description. It was as though the physical facts of the scene had been gradually pressed into a shape that better suited the conclusion. The family, according to public statements and later recollections, did not stop asking for a clearer explanation. They questioned the speed of the ruling. They questioned why some early comments from investigators had been softened or withdrawn. They questioned how a young woman could leave a lit parking lot, travel a route no one could map with confidence, and end up in a place that several officers initially treated as suspicious, only for that suspicion to evaporate within days. None of that proves foul play. It does not prove anything at all. But the unease came from the movement of the story itself. Facts usually grow firmer with time. In this case, they seem to grow softer, blurred at the edges, as if each revision had been made not to sharpen the truth, but to make it less difficult to live with. Then there was the call. It appeared in some retellings and vanished in others, which only made it worse. According to discussions that surfaced years afterward, a 911 call came in during the hours before the body was found. The caller did not give a name. There was either breathing on the line or wind. Different people remembered it differently. One former dispatcher reportedly said a woman had tried to speak but stopped. Another version claimed there were two sounds, one close to the receiver and one farther back, like a chair scraping a floor. The call was not treated publicly as central to the case, and no complete recording has ever been widely released. Still, one reference to a distressed open line lingered in an internal log summary. It was time-stamped well after the victim had last been seen, and close enough to the discovery of the body to trouble anyone who noticed it. The most unsettling part was not that the call existed, but that it sat beside a note suggesting the phone later recovered with the victim showed water exposure so severe that investigators were uncertain whether it could have been used during that window at all. That contradiction was never fully explained in public. Perhaps the call came from someone else. Perhaps the timing was off, perhaps a deputy wrote down the wrong device. Those are ordinary possibilities. But the file did not read like a file that had encountered an ordinary mistake and corrected it. It read like a file that had stepped around certain facts and left them behind in the dark. A retired clerk from the courthouse, speaking years later to someone collecting local case histories, described the folder itself in a way that people in town still repeated. She said it felt thinner than it should have. She said there were places where pages had clearly once been fastened together and no longer were. She remembered an evidence sheet with item numbers continuing in sequence until one line, where a space had been left large enough for several words and then crossed through with a single pen stroke. She could not recall what had been written there first. She only remembered that the ink used to strike it out was darker and newer than the type on the rest of the page. That is a small thing. It might mean nothing. In a room full of old files, almost everything looks altered, but the image stayed with people because it fit too neatly with the rest of the case. Not destroyed, not solved, only adjusted. As the years passed, the town did what small towns do with unresolved stories. It set them down in layers. The older generation spoke about carelessness, favoritism, and officials who wanted the matter finished before it stained the county too deeply. Younger people added a different edge. They talked about the empty house, they talked about the rear bedroom and the missing audio. Some said a hunter had once gone inside there at dusk and found old police tape in a dresser drawer, though no one ever proved it. Others claimed that if a car stopped on the ridge road after midnight and the engine was cut, the creek below sounded wrong, not like moving water, but like somebody dragging a wet bundle through weeds. No one sensible called that evidence. It was only a rumor, the kind that grows where documents go silent. Still, there was one detail even the skeptics found difficult to shake. In one early photograph, reproduced badly in a local archive before access tightened, the vacant house could be seen in the background beyond the tree line. Its rear window reflected the morning in a flat, pale square. At first glance, there was nothing there. But a former reporter, looking closely years later, believed there was a shape at the glass. Not a face exactly, more like someone standing a step back from the window and watching the search below. The image quality was poor. It could have been curtain, glare, damage to the print. Yet that same reporter said the original contact sheet for the scene later seemed incomplete, with one frame missing between two shots taken seconds apart. He never proved that either. He only said that every time he tried to trace the sequence, the records broke apart in his hands. The county moved on, the house collapsed by degrees, the field behind it grew up wild. New deputies came in who knew the story only as something older officers dismissed with a tired look. Officially, nothing remained open. There was no murder to solve, no abductor to identify, no conspiracy waiting under the surface of public record. There was only a young woman whose death had been explained, and a town that did not quite believe the explanation it had been given. In daylight, that seemed manageable. At church suppers and football games, people spoke of other things. But on winter nights, when the roads emptied early and the hills held their breath, the old contradictions came back with the dark. Some said the worst part was how ordinary the file sounded if read quickly. It did not shout. It did not confess. It offered no final revelation hidden in a margin. It simply failed in a few quiet places to line up with itself. A coat where it should not have been. Shoes too clean for the bank. A house entered and then forgotten. An item of audio recovered and then no longer mentioned. A call that arrived from nowhere and settled nowhere. These were not answers. They were absences shaped like answers, and that was what made the case endure. An unsolved crime can be named, an accident can be mourned, but a story that has been gently pressed into the wrong shape leaves behind a different kind of fear, one with no edge to hold. Long after the papers were boxed away, there were people in that part of southern Ohio who still slowed when they passed the old pull-off above the creek. They did it without meaning to. They looked down through the brush, past the black water and the low tangle of branches, toward the place where the first flashlights moved before dawn and the first version of the truth had briefly shown itself. Then they drove on, back toward the lit houses and the gas stations and the safer explanations. But the feeling stayed with them. Not that something supernatural had happened there, not even that the town had uncovered a monster and hidden it, only that somewhere in the first hours, before the signatures and the final ruling, somebody had seen one detail too many, and that detail had been trimmed away so the rest could close around it. What remained was smaller than a haunting and colder than a legend. It was the possibility that the most disturbing thing in the file had never been the death at all, but the care with which certain parts of it had been made to disappear. A British Columbia forest report was filed and then removed. The digital log appeared on the regional supervisor's terminal at 3:14 a.m., tagged with a priority code that had not been used in the British Columbia Provincial Forestry Network in over 20 years. The supervisor, a man who had spent 3 decades monitoring the vast unmapped expanses of the coastal wilderness, sat forward in his chair. The night shift in the Victoria Dispatch Office was usually quiet, punctuated only by the occasional automated weather update or a routine check-in from a logging crew. But this was different. The flashing alert on his screen indicated a code-red environmental anomaly. It had been submitted by a senior timber cruiser stationed deep in a remote, protected sector of the Great Bear Rainforest, more than 200 miles from the nearest paved road. The supervisor clicked to open the file. The surveyor had uploaded a text document containing 3 short paragraphs and a single, low-resolution audio attachment. The text did not describe a wildfire, an aggressive grizzly bear, or a poaching camp. Instead, the seasoned surveyor described an area of old-growth cedar where the topography had seemingly folded in on itself overnight. He wrote that the tree trunks in a 2-mile radius had turned entirely white, drained of all color and moisture, and that the ambient air pressure was fluctuating so violently it had cracked the glass face of his analog compass. The final sentence of the text report simply read, "They are emitting a low, continuous mechanical hum." Before the supervisor could click the play button on the audio file, his screen flashed a sudden flat gray. The terminal froze for a fraction of a second, the cooling fan humming loudly in the empty office. When the system refreshed and the network connection stabilized, the inbox was completely empty. The glowing red priority alert was gone. The submission log, which recorded every piece of incoming data down to the microsecond, showed no entry for that hour. The report had not just been deleted or moved to a spam folder. According to the architecture of the provincial server, the file had never existed. The supervisor immediately picked up his desk phone and called the overnight information technology department. He woke a technician who remotely accessed the regional router to run a diagnostic trace. The technician sounded confused as he reported his findings. He confirmed that a data packet of significant size had indeed pinged the primary receiver at exactly 3:14 a.m., but the origin node was now returning a fatal error. Someone or something had executed a hard scrub of the network. Furthermore, the GPS coordinates attached to the surveyor's transmission were now blocked out on the digital map. The sector, a dense valley previously mapped and surveyed dozens of times, was now registered in the database as a blank, unassigned zone. By 6 o'clock in the morning, a quiet panic had begun to set in among the upper management of the forestry department. The surveyor was a veteran of the woods, a man who spent months alone in the deep bush and was known for his grounded, pragmatic nature. He was not prone to exaggeration, and he certainly did not possess the technical capability to hack a secure government database to erase his own reports. The department authorized a private helicopter charter to fly over the coordinates at first light, bypassing the official search and rescue channels to avoid drawing unwanted attention to the missing data. The pilot reached the airspace above the valley at 8:30 a.m. The weather across the coast was clear, with bright morning sunlight illuminating the endless sea of green pine and cedar. But as the helicopter banked over the specific coordinates, the pilot radioed back to dispatch with a hesitant voice. A perfectly circular column of thick gray fog was rising from the valley floor, obscuring the canopy entirely. The fog was not drifting with the wind. It remained entirely stationary, rising like a solid pillar. The pilot noted that as he passed within 1 mile of the fog bank, his instrument panel began to flicker, and a loud, rhythmic static washed out his communication relay. He was ordered to return to base immediately. A small, specialized ground crew was assembled 48 hours later. They were briefed only that a surveyor had missed his scheduled satellite check-in and that equipment failure was suspected. The team drove for 6 hours up deteriorating logging routes, finally abandoning their trucks when the mud became too deep. They hiked for another 2 days through the dense, wet undergrowth of the rainforest. The expedition leader later noted in his personal journal that the transition into the surveyor's sector was not gradual. It happened over the course of a single step. One moment, the team was walking through a vibrant, noisy ecosystem filled with the sounds of dripping water, rustling leaves, and calling birds. The next moment, they crossed an invisible threshold into absolute, suffocating silence. The air grew instantly cold, and the smell of damp earth was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. The forest floor here was covered in a fine, pale dust that resembled ash, though there were no signs of a fire. As they pushed deeper into the valley, they saw the trees. Just as the deleted report had described, the towering ancient cedars had been stripped of their bark and color. The wood was bone white, smooth to the touch, and strangely warm. The branches were completely bare, reaching up into a canopy that was shrouded in the unnatural stationary fog. The ground team moved slowly, their unease growing with every silent step. There was no wind, yet the white trees seemed to vibrate slightly, transferring a deep, sub-audible tremor through the soles of the searchers' boots. They found the surveyor's camp just before dusk. The heavy canvas tent was fully erected and entirely untouched. His camp stove, climbing gear, and emergency rations were neatly organized on a folding table. The site showed no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, and no indication of a hasty departure. However, when the expedition leader unzipped the tent to look inside, he found the surveyor's heavy winter jacket laid perfectly flat on the sleeping bag. The jacket was completely dehydrated. The synthetic fabric crumbled into brittle flakes when the leader tried to pick it up, as if all moisture had been instantly baked out of it in a vacuum. Sitting beside the crumbled jacket was the surveyor's physical logbook. It was a heavy, leather-bound ledger required by the province for legal record-keeping. The leader opened it, hoping to find a written copy of the deleted digital report. The first 40 pages were filled with mundane daily notes, weather observations, and soil acidity measurements. But the pages covering the final 3 days of his deployment had been removed. They were not torn out in a rush. They had been excised with surgical precision, sliced perfectly down the binding so that barely a paper fiber remained. The only electronic device left in the camp was a secondary handheld GPS unit resting on a stump outside the tent. The search team gathered around it as the technician powered the screen on. The battery was somehow fully charged. It took a moment to acquire a satellite lock. When the numbers finally populated on the display, the team stared at the screen in silence. According to the uncorrupted hardware, their current elevation was not 4,000 feet above sea level, where they should have been. The device registered their elevation as a negative number, insisting they were currently standing 3 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. The expedition leader ordered an immediate retreat. The team hiked through the night, using headlamps to navigate the maze of bleached, vibrating trees, desperate to reach the tree line where the normal forest resumed. They left the camp exactly as they found it, taking only the corrupted GPS unit and the altered logbook. They spoke very little on the long drive back to civilization, each man privately haunted by the sheer, unnatural wrongness of the dead valley. When the team submitted their findings to the regional office, the response was swift and bureaucratic. The photographs they took of the white trees were confiscated and classified under a vague Environmental Protection Act. The anomalous GPS unit was sent to a federal laboratory in Ottawa and never returned. The surveyor was officially declared lost in the woods, his disappearance attributed to a tragic, unverified fall into a fast-moving river. A public warning was issued designating the specific coordinates as an unstable landslide zone, strictly off-limits to all hikers and commercial logging operations. The regional supervisor, who had seen the original, vanished report, chose to retire early a few months later. He packed up his desk, handed over his keys, and moved to a small town on the eastern edge of the province, far away from the deep woods. But he could never quite shake the memory of that night shift. He often thought about the speed with which the system had scrubbed the file, a deliberate erasure executed from a level of authority he could not even comprehend. Most of all, he thought about the audio file he never got to hear. Years later, rumors began to circulate among the older forest rangers. They whispered about illegal, deep earth acoustic scanning taking place in the remote sectors. They traded stories about campers who wandered too close to the hazard zones and reported hearing a sound that carried on the wind. It was not the sound of a landslide or a river or an animal. According to the locals who lived near the edge of the deep wilderness, on particularly quiet nights, you could stand at the boundary line and hear a low, continuous mechanical hum rising from beneath the roots of the trees. He reported something strange in Yosemite, then he vanished. By the time the second call came over the radio, the ranger station had already marked him as delayed. His last check-in had been thin with static. A clipped voice carried through the dark like something dragged across stone. He had said the trail was empty. He had said the campfire smoke had no source. Then, after a pause so long the dispatcher thought the signal had dropped, he added that something was moving below the tree line where nothing should have been moving at all. The trail he had been assigned to watch was one of the quieter routes in Yosemite, a long and narrowing path used mostly by experienced hikers, backcountry campers, and the occasional photographer who preferred the high silence away from the valley roads. It was the kind of place where a person could walk for hours without hearing another voice. The incident reports from that stretch were ordinary most of the time. Twisted ankles, lost gear, improper food storage, Once in a while, someone would claim they had heard footsteps outside their tent and found no tracks in the morning. But reports like that were usually set aside with a line about nerves, wind, or distant wildlife moving after dark. Even so, there had been enough strange complaints over the years to give that trail a reputation among seasonal staff. A few hikers had described hearing slow movement in the brush far above them in places too steep for a person to climb and too bare to hide a bear. One couple said they watched stones roll down from an exposed ledge and expected to see a deer or mountain lion at the top, but nothing appeared. Another report mentioned a shape passing between trees after midnight, not crossing the trail, not approaching camp, only keeping pace for nearly half a mile. None of it was considered reliable. The park received stories like that every season. The mountains made distance, behaved strangely, sound traveled where it should not, shapes changed in moonlight. People came back tired and uncertain and ashamed of how frightened they had been by ordinary darkness. The ranger who went missing was not known for nerves. According to other staff, he was methodical, patient, the sort of man who wrote neat field notes even in bad weather. He had worked enough summer seasons in the Sierra to know the difference between a branch rubbing in the wind and something walking with intent. His reports were usually spare. If he said he heard a coyote, he meant a coyote. If he said he found bear sign, he gave the distance, the condition of the scat, the direction of travel, and nothing else. People later returned to that detail because of what appeared in his final log. It was not the language of a man looking for drama, it was the language of a man trying very hard not to name what he was seeing. The first call that evening had not sounded urgent. He mentioned an abandoned cooking area near a prohibited zone, then corrected himself and said it only looked abandoned. The fire ring was still warm, but there was no tent, no packs, no wrappers, no boot prints he could trust on the hard ground. Just smoke breathing out of blackened stones and a smell he could not identify. Not meat, not pine. Something damp and bitter, as if green wood had been burned with wet cloth over it. He said he would keep moving along the trail and circle back before midnight. That should have been the end of it. An hour later, he radioed again. This time, he sounded distracted. He reported hearing movement uphill from the switchbacks above the granite shelf, where the slope opened into loose stone and sparse timber. That was the part of the message that lingered in old retellings. He did not say he heard an animal. He did not say he heard a person. He said movement more than once, staying parallel. Too heavy for falling rock, too deliberate for wind. Then he said the same thing had stopped whenever he stopped. The dispatcher asked whether he wanted another ranger sent out from the lower access road. There was a pause. Then came the answer, quiet enough that it almost disappeared in the static. He said no, not yet. He said he thought he had found tracks, but they made no sense. The ground was shallow, with dust and dry needles. He described depressions that seemed almost like barefoot prints, except too long, too narrow, and spaced too far apart along the edge of a wash where no one would choose to walk at night. A few moments later, he corrected himself again. He said perhaps they were not prints at all. He said he could only see them clearly when he looked away from them. By the time the moon rose over the ridge, the station had started logging his calls more carefully. Other rangers later claimed that the tone of the night changed after that point. Not the forest itself. The room inside the station, radios were turned down lower, coffee went cold on the desk. A senior ranger stood over the map with one hand flat against the table, listening to empty bursts of static between transmissions. The missing ranger checked in once more and said he had reached a point overlooking a dry creek bed. He could see the pale ribbon of stone below him. He could see, or believed he could see, something shifting along it in sections as if parts of the darkness were moving separately and then joining again. When asked whether it might be a bear, he answered too quickly. No. Too low to the ground at first, he said, then too high. Search teams later found the place where he had stopped. The beam from his flashlight was discovered lying against a fallen log, still intact, though the batteries were nearly spent by then. His hat was recovered farther downslope, caught in a stand of brush. The dirt around both items offered almost nothing. No drag marks, no clear blood. No sign of struggle that anyone could point to with confidence. There were scuffs in the dust and fresh stone turned over near the creek bed, but a search area in the mountains changes quickly once boots begin crossing it. What unsettled some of the team was not what they found, but what they did not. There was no obvious path of retreat, no clean line of tracks leading away. It was as though he had set his light down to look at something and then simply ceased to have weight. His field notebook turned up the following afternoon in a shallow break in the granite, protected from the wind by chance or by placement. The earlier entries were ordinary: campsite checks, trail erosion, a note about a fallen branch blocking part of the route. Then, near the end, the writing changed. Lines slanted downward, words crowded together. He mentioned hearing stones click against each other below the ridge. He mentioned the smell returning. He wrote that the deer had gone silent long before sunset, which he found wrong for that area. Then came the line most often repeated in whispers by people who know the story only halfway. Something moving where no wildlife should have been. No antler corridor, no cover. No reason for anything living to be there. Beneath that, in smaller writing, he added that it seemed to understand the trail better than he did. There was one final entry written so quickly that some investigators later disagreed about the exact wording. Most versions say he noted a shape standing in the creek bed where moments earlier there had been nothing at all. Others believed the line described not a shape, but a section of darkness that remained after the moon moved on. The page ended with an unfinished sentence about height, not how tall it was, how high its shoulders seemed when it crossed the stone. That detail disturbed people because the creek bed offered little cover, and because anything crossing there should have made sound, should have dislodged rock, should have announced itself in one of the many ordinary ways that living things do. The notebook gave no such sound, only the statement that it was closer now. At some point after reading the notebook, members of the search team began sharing their own observations more reluctantly. One ranger admitted that during the second night of the search, he heard what sounded like slow footfalls above camp, pacing from one side of the slope to the other without ever descending. Another said he woke before dawn and saw a figure near the tree line, standing at an angle that suggested it was looking down into camp, though when he fully sat up, it was no longer there. These accounts were never treated as evidence. Officially, they remained exhausted impressions from men who had spent too many hours in cold air under too little sleep. But in the years that followed, some of those same men refused assignments on that trail after dark. The practical explanations were many and sober: a fall into a narrow crevice, a medical event in rough country, disorientation, exposure. Yosemite is not gentle to the lost, and the distance between a misstep and a disappearance can be very small in the high backcountry. Search operations in such terrain are always imperfect. Ravines hide what they take, snow arrives, water shifts debris, animals scatter what little remains. There was never enough to prove anything else. That, in a way, made the story worse. The mountain offered no conclusion, only absence, and absence has room for every kind of rumor. Still, the reports did not stop. Over the following seasons, a handful of hikers from that same corridor described odd disturbances that fit too neatly with the old notebook to be comfortable. One man claimed he heard someone walking beside him in the dark while he packed his campsite, though every time he turned his head, the sound shifted farther uphill. A pair of backpackers told staff they had seen a distant light moving below the ridge, too low and too steady to be a headlamp carried by a person. A woman who came down from the trail at dawn said she had listened to pebbles roll in short, measured bursts from the creek bed below her, as if something was crossing stone in careful steps. She waited for a deer. She waited for a bear. The creek bed stayed empty. Among local retellings, the story changed shape the way mountain stories often do. Some said the missing ranger found evidence of an illegal camp and followed the wrong people into the trees. Some said he succumbed to altitude and fear, that the notebook recorded the unraveling of a tired mind. Others, more quietly, repeated the older belief that there are places in wilderness where human pathways cut through ground that does not welcome being mapped or patrolled. In those versions, the thing on the slope was never described clearly. It did not need to be. It was enough that it moved where nothing should move, and that a man trained to recognize the ordinary world had taken one look and failed to place it inside that world at all. Years later, portions of the incident file were reportedly requested by people with no relation to the family, no legal reason, no clear purpose beyond curiosity. One former employee, speaking only in general terms, said the strangest part of reviewing the file was the radio transcript. On paper, the missing ranger sounded calm right up until the end. Not calm in the reassuring sense. Calm in the brittle sense, like someone holding still while waiting for a large animal to choose whether or not to come closer. His final transmission was broken by static and never fully recovered, but most versions agree on the last clear phrase. It is there in old copies and in the memory of those who heard it live. He said it had stepped onto the trail behind him, though he had never heard it climb. The trail remains open. People still walk it beneath clean morning light, with granite shining pale through the trees and ravens turning slowly over the ridges. Most return with photographs, sore legs, and no story worth telling. But now and then, according to rangers and hikers who speak cautiously about such things, someone comes back altered by a night they cannot explain. They describe an empty section of trail that felt occupied. They mention a smell like wet ash where no fire had burned. They admit, often with embarrassment, that they heard movement pacing them from a slope too barren to hide a living thing. Those reports are still written down in the plain language of park paperwork and filed among the ordinary troubles of the backcountry. Yet the old story remains beneath them, quiet and persistent, like water under stone, because the ranger was never found, because his light was left facing the trees. And because in the final line he ever wrote, he did not say he was being followed. He wrote that whatever had been moving out there had finally learned where the trail would take him. An Appalachian cabin case with no footprints leading in or out. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Deputy Miller reached the tree line. The snow was knee-deep and completely untouched, pale and luminous under the light of a fractured moon. No tracks led up to the porch. No paths broke the smooth, glittering surface of the drifts. Yet, the heavy oak front door of the cabin was standing wide open, a dark, gaping rectangle against the weathered wood. A single lantern swung gently from the rafters inside, casting long, erratic shadows across the snow-covered threshold. The county dispatcher had received the call exactly 1 hour earlier, a frantic voice whispering that someone was outside the windows. But the fresh powder, undisturbed for at least 12 hours, told a different, impossible story. The cabin sat at the end of an unnamed logging road, a mile and a half from County Route 44, buried deep within the Appalachian spine. It belonged to an older man, a retired archivist who spent his winters in total isolation, seeking the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep woods. For nearly 20 years, the man had never called emergency services. He was known in the nearest town only as a shadow who bought bulk supplies in November and disappeared until the spring thaw. But according to the 911 operator who took the call at 2:15 a.m., the man had been entirely coherent, speaking in a low, terrified hush. He claimed he could hear heavy, wet footsteps circling the exterior walls, pressing against the glass. He said they sounded like someone walking in soaked leather boots. Miller stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to make the moisture in his nose freeze with every inhalation. He aimed his heavy flashlight at the ground, sweeping the blinding beam across the expanse of snow, separating the forest edge from the cabin. Nothing. The snow was a pristine, glittering sheet stretching out for 50 yards in every direction. Not a single indentation, not an animal track, not a displaced branch. If someone had been circling the cabin just 45 minutes ago, they had done it without ever touching the ground. He approached slowly, forcing his way through the deep drifts, creating the only trail in the entire clearing. The silence was absolute, the kind of crushing quiet that makes the ears ring and the heart beat too loud. As he stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards groaned under his heavy winter boots. He drew his service weapon, his fingers stiff and clumsy inside his thick gloves. He called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the dense trees and the falling snow. No answer came from the dark interior. There was only the rhythmic creak of the swinging lantern, its fuel nearly exhausted, the flame sputtering and throwing wild, shifting shadows against the log walls. Miller crossed the threshold, stepping out of the wind and into the gloom. The inside of the cabin was freezing, the iron stove in the corner entirely cold, radiating a deep, metallic chill. But there was a scent in the air that did not belong in the high mountains during winter. It was not the familiar smell of pine, wood smoke, or old paper. It smelled heavily of stagnant water, river mud, and wet, decaying earth. It was a thick, humid odor that clung to the back of the throat. He shined his light across the wooden floorboards, moving past the small kitchen area. There, clearly illuminated in the harsh white beam, was a trail of dark, wet footprints. The prints began abruptly in the center of the room, far from the doors and windows. They were large, the shape of a heavy work boot without treads, caked in thick, dark mud that was already beginning to freeze into rigid ridges on the floor. Miller followed the trail with his flashlight, his breathing growing shallow. The prints did not lead toward the open front door. They did not lead toward the rear window, which was bolted shut from the inside with a heavy iron latch. They walked in a tight, deliberate circle around a faded armchair facing the cold fireplace. The tracks overlapped, pacing over and over in the exact same loop, tracking freezing mud deep into the fibers of a braided wool rug. The armchair was empty. A thick wool blanket lay tangled on the floor beside it, as if someone had stood up in a blind panic, kicking it away. On the small wooden side table, a ceramic cup of coffee sat untouched. Miller stepped closer, careful not to disturb the muddy tracks, and pressed the side of the mug with his bare knuckle. It was still warm. The archivist had been sitting here, drinking coffee in the dead of the night, while something paced around him in tight, muddy circles. And then the old man was simply gone, leaving no trace of a struggle and no tracks leading away. Miller raised his light, searching the rafters, the dark corners, the narrow loft above the bed. The cabin was a single open room with nowhere to hide. He walked toward the telephone mounted on the far wall near the pantry. The receiver was dangling by its coiled cord, swaying slightly, a faint dial tone hissing like static in the quiet room. Beneath the phone, a small yellow notepad lay open on a slanted wooden desk. A pen had rolled off the edge and lay on the floorboards. The final entry on the notepad was written in hurried, uneven handwriting, pressing so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through the page. It was completely unlike the precise, careful script found in the rest of the notebooks stacked on the desk. The ink was still fresh, smeared at the edges by a trembling hand. It read simply, "They are not outside." The realization settled over Miller like ice water against the spine. The panicked call to the 911 operator had not been a plea for help against an intruder in the snow. It had been a desperate, fatal misinterpretation. The heavy, wet footsteps the man heard through the walls were not echoing from the woods, they were echoing from the floorboards directly behind his chair. Backup arrived 2 hours later, fighting their way up the snow-choked logging road with tire chains and floodlights. They found Miller sitting on the front porch, staring out at the unbroken expanse of snow, his radio turned off. They tore the cabin apart, looking for hidden compartments or cellar doors, but found nothing but solid earth beneath the foundation. They searched the woods for a radius of 5 miles, bringing in tracking dogs at dawn. The dogs refused to approach the cabin, whining and pulling back toward the cruisers. They dragged the frozen creek down in the valley. They found no trace of the archivist, not a single scrap of clothing, not a drop of blood. Furthermore, they found no explanation for the mud inside the cabin, which laboratory testing later revealed was composed of brackish sediment from a coastal swamp basin located over 400 miles away. The case file was eventually boxed away, labeled as an unsolved disappearance, though the details were heavily redacted in the public reports. Local residents rarely speak of the old cabin, and even seasoned hunters refuse to track through that specific section of the woods during the winter months. To this day, the official records maintain the impossible contradiction of that night. The wet mud inside the cabin remained frozen onto the floorboards for weeks. The snow outside remained perfectly undisturbed until the spring thaw melted it away. The archivist never walked out of that front door, but something else walked in, leaving its filth on the floor without ever taking a step across the snow. A Northern California cabin had a door that opened from inside. The sound was unmistakable. It was the heavy, metallic thud of a steel deadbolt sliding into place, followed by the definitive click of the locking mechanism. Thomas stood motionless on the rotting wooden porch, the freezing rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was entirely alone, 20 miles from the nearest paved road. He stared at the weathered oak door of the cabin. His own right hand was still holding the brass key, having just secured the exterior padlock seconds ago. Yet, someone or something inside the dark, windowless cabin had just thrown the inner latch, effectively locking him out. It was late November of 1996. The isolated parcel of land sat deep within the ancient, dripping forests of Mendocino County. Thomas was a county appraiser tasked with evaluating the abandoned estate of a man named Arthur Vance. According to local records, Vance had walked away from his property 6 years earlier, driving to the county sheriff's office and handing over a ring of heavy iron keys. The man had refused to speak of the cabin, only stating that the property was no longer his and that no one should ever go back there after sundown. The journey to the property that morning had been an exercise in isolation. As Thomas had navigated his truck off the main highway and onto the unmarked dirt logging roads, the towering redwoods had seemed to close in around him, their massive trunks blocking out the pale autumn sunlight. The local radio station had dissolved into a haze of white static miles ago. The deeper he drove into the forested hills, the quieter the world became. By the time he reached the rusted iron gate marking the property line, the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the steady drum of rain against his windshield. Thomas had heard the rumors, of course. Small towns always held on to stories of eccentric hermits and cursed land, but Thomas was a man of measurements, property lines, and tax codes. He had arrived at the cabin at 2 in the afternoon, armed with a clipboard and a heavy flashlight. The structure itself was an anomaly. It was built from massive, untreated pine logs, but it completely lacked windows. The only point of entry was the single, solid oak door at the front, reinforced with thick iron bands and fitted with an absurd number of locks on both the inside and the outside. When Thomas had first unlocked the door and stepped inside earlier that afternoon, the air had tasted stale, metallic, and incredibly heavy. His flashlight beam had cut through thick, suspended dust, revealing a single, massive room. There was no furniture, there was no stove. There were only bare wooden floorboards sloping inexplicably toward the exact center of the room. In the corners, thousands of dead, desiccated flies were swept into neat, deliberate piles. The atmosphere had been so intensely oppressive that Thomas had found it difficult to draw a full breath, as if the room itself was actively rejecting his presence. By 4:30 p.m., the pale winter sun had dipped behind the towering redwoods, plunging the forest into a deep, premature twilight. A heavy, freezing rain had begun to fall. Thomas had decided to end his inspection early, eager to escape the suffocating air of the cabin. He had stepped out onto the porch, pulled the heavy oak door shut, and threaded a thick steel chain through the exterior iron hasps, securing it with a heavy brass padlock. He had turned the key, satisfied that the structure was completely sealed. And that was when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of the interior deadbolt sliding shut. Thomas stood on the porch, his hand resting on the wet iron chain. He leaned his ear against the damp wood of the door. He held his breath, straining to hear any movement from within. There was only silence, the heavy, dead silence of an empty room. He stepped back slowly, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. There was no other way into the structure. No windows, no cellar doors, no gaps in the heavy log roof. Whatever had thrown that deadbolt was trapped inside. Or Thomas thought with a sudden chill. It had simply wanted to ensure that Thomas stayed outside. He slowly backed down the wooden steps, his boots sinking into the muddy ground, keeping his eyes fixed on the blank wooden door until he reached the safety of his truck. Thomas climbed into the cab, locking the doors and turning the ignition just enough to run the heater. The digital clock on the dashboard read 5:15 p.m. He wiped the condensation from the inside of the windshield, peering through the driving rain at the dark shape of the cabin. The wind picked up, violently thrashing the branches of the surrounding pines, but the cabin stood immovable, a black void against the gray trees. Hours dragged by in agonizing slowness. The rain transitioned into a steady, freezing mist. By midnight, Thomas had managed to drift into a shallow, uneasy sleep, his head resting against the cold glass of the driver's side window. He was awakened abruptly by a sound that cut cleanly through the white noise of the weather. It was a low, rhythmic thud. It sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the hollow floorboards of the cabin. Thomas sat up slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the structure. It was barely visible in the heavy fog that had rolled in from the coast. The thudding continued. 4 steps in one direction. A pause. 4 steps back. The sound was immense, carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for a human being. The thick floorboards inside creaked and groaned in protest with every single step. His trembling hand reached for the headlight switch. He pulled it. The high beams violently illuminated the clearing, casting stark, shifting shadows against the front of the cabin. The instant the harsh yellow light struck the weathered wood of the door, the pacing stopped entirely. The silence that followed was immediate, unnatural, and suffocating. Thomas stared at the heavy door, watching the fog drift through the beams of light. For 10 long minutes, absolutely nothing happened. He considered putting the truck in gear and driving back down the muddy access road, abandoning the assessment entirely. But the twisting, unpaved logging road was treacherous in the daylight and practically a death trap in a freezing midnight fog. He had no choice but to sit in the cold truck and wait for morning. He reached out and pushed the headlight switch back in. The clearing plunged into absolute darkness once more. Almost immediately, the brass doorknob of the cabin began to rattle. Thomas could hear it clearly over the howling wind. The knob was turning frantically, twisting left and right as if unseen hands were violently shaking it. Then came the sound of heavy fists hammering against the inside of the wood, a frantic, desperate pounding that shook the entire frame of the building. According to the official county records filed weeks later, the physical mechanics of what happened next were entirely impossible. The cabin door was constructed to swing inward. It rested against a thick, load-bearing wooden frame that prevented it from opening outward under any circumstances. Furthermore, Thomas had secured the outside with a heavy steel chain, and the interior deadbolt was firmly locked in place. The heavy thudding against the wood suddenly changed into a steady, agonizing groan. Thomas turned the headlights back on, his hands shaking violently. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The heavy oak door was bowing outward. It was curving toward the porch under the strain of an immense, unseen pressure from within. The thick iron hinges were screaming in the cold air, the metal bending as the solid wood was pushed slowly, impossibly, in the completely wrong direction. The steel chain Thomas had wrapped around the exterior hasps pulled taut, grinding against the rusted iron. The door continued to bulge outward, the wood splintering along the center seam. Thomas watched, paralyzed by a deep, primal terror, as the heavy frame of the cabin began to crack under the strain. The sound of rending wood echoed through the dark forest, loud and sharp like cannon fire. With a deafening snap, the interior deadbolt sheared completely off its mountings. A second later, the exterior steel chain exploded, the padlock tearing cleanly through the rusted iron hasp. The heavy oak door burst violently outward, ripping entirely free from its twisted hinges and crashing down onto the wet wooden porch with a massive thud. Thomas slammed his back against the driver's seat, his eyes wide, waiting for whatever had been inside to emerge into the harsh light of his high beams. He stared at the gaping black rectangle of the doorway. The interior of the cabin was an impenetrable well of darkness. a void that seemed to swallow the light from his truck. He waited for a shape, a shadow, a movement. He waited for hours. Nothing ever came out. The rest of the night passed in a state of suspended terror. Thomas did not lower his eyes from the open doorway. He did not turn off the headlights until the battery began to die. As the first gray light of morning finally began to bleed through the canopy of the redwoods, the thick fog slowly dissipated. The forest was entirely still. The cabin stood silent in the pale morning light, its front torn open like a jagged wound. Sometime around 8 in the morning, Thomas finally found the strength to unlock his truck door. His legs were completely numb as he walked slowly across the muddy clearing toward the porch. He stepped over the shattered remains of the heavy steel chain, the brass padlock lying mangled in the dirt. He slowly approached the porch and looked down at the heavy oak door lying on the wet wood. The exterior of the door was battered and weathered from decades of exposure to the elements, but as Thomas carefully stepped over it to look at the interior side, his blood ran completely cold. The inside of the door was completely smooth. There were no scratch marks, there were no dents, there was absolutely no evidence that anything had struck, pushed, or hammered against the wood from the inside. The heavy iron latch of the deadbolt was still fully extended, having been snapped off by sheer blunt force. Trembling, Thomas raised his heavy flashlight and aimed it into the open doorway of the cabin. The pale beam swept across the bare, slanting floorboards. The neat piles of dead flies in the corners were completely undisturbed. But what haunted Thomas, and what would eventually force him to abandon his career entirely, was the dust. The thick gray layer of dust coating the floor of the cabin was perfectly even, pristine, and entirely unbroken. Not a single footprint marked the floor. Nothing had walked across the room to slide the deadbolt shut the evening before. Nothing had paced back and forth in the darkness during the night. And nothing had pressed against the heavy oak door to force it open. The structure had simply locked itself, held its breath in the dark, and then violently torn itself open from the inside out. Local residents still refused to hunt in that specific section of the Mendocino woods. The abandoned property remains entirely unsold. According to local hunters, who occasionally wander too close to the property line, the cabin is still standing, slowly rotting away into the forest floor. They say that on quiet winter nights, if you stand near the rusted iron gate, you can hear the distinct sound of heavy, dragging footsteps pacing back and forth in the darkness, waiting patiently for someone to bring a new door and try to lock it again. A Yellowstone report from 2012 was never filed. The smell was the first thing that confirmed something was terribly wrong in the clearing, a heavy scent of scorched copper and sulfur that hung unnaturally still in the cold mountain air. Elias, a seasoned backcountry ranger, stood at the edge of the tree line and stared at what remained of the Geological Survey camp. The campsite was located deep within the Thoroughfare region of Yellowstone, a massive expanse of wilderness widely considered the most remote area in the lower 48 states. It was late October of 2012, and the three-person survey team was officially 4 days overdue. Elias had hiked for 2 days through dense pine forests and over jagged ridges to reach their last known coordinates. He had expected to find a twisted ankle, a broken radio, or perhaps a group of researchers simply running behind schedule. Instead, he found absolute silence and a scene that defied all logic. The large dome tent sat in the center of the clearing, but it had not been collapsed by wind or torn by a grizzly bear. The bright orange nylon was entirely melted, fused together into a hard, glossy shell that reflected the gray afternoon light. The damage did not look like the result of a campfire gone out of control. There was no ash, no charred wood, and the dry yellow grass surrounding the tent was perfectly untouched. It looked as though an intense, localized heat source had baked the tent from the inside out, causing the synthetic material to shrink and petrify around the aluminum poles. The poles themselves were warped inward, bent as if subjected to immense and sudden atmospheric pressure. Elias did not call out. The profound quiet of the forest seemed to press against his ears, and an instinct older than his training told him to remain completely silent. He approached the petrified structure slowly, his boots crunching lightly on the frost-hardened dirt. He unholstered his bear spray, though he already knew that no animal was responsible for this. Peering through a melted gap in the nylon, he saw the 3 sleeping bags. They were empty, but they were compressed, flattened against the floor of the tent as if smoothed down by a heavy weight. There were no backpacks, no boots, and no sign of the expensive thermal imaging equipment the team had brought with them. The only item left behind was a small green field journal lying in the dirt near the fire ring. Elias picked it up. The cover was warm to the touch, despite the ambient temperature hovering near 30 degrees. He opened the journal. The first dozen pages were filled with standard scientific notations, neatly written columns detailing soil acidity, water temperatures, and seismic readings from the nearby thermal vents. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting began to deteriorate. The neat columns gave way to sprawling, erratic sentences that pushed off the edges of the paper. The entries from 3 days prior stopped mentioning geology entirely. Instead, the lead researcher had written repeatedly about a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the empty spaces between the trees. The final entry, written in a frantic, pressing hand, consisted of only one sentence. It read, "The shadows are unlatching from the pines, and they do not cast themselves on the ground." Elias felt a cold prickle of sweat form at the base of his neck. He reached for his shoulder radio, keying the microphone to contact the dispatch center at Mammoth Hot Springs. He spoke softly, identifying himself and requesting an immediate emergency channel. He waited for the familiar burst of static and the dispatcher's voice. Instead, the radio emitted a sound he had never heard before. It was a wet, rhythmic tearing noise, followed by a slow, dragging exhalation that sounded impossibly close. It did not sound like signal interference. It sounded like something breathing directly into a microphone in a hollow, echoing room. Elias released the button, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried again. The same slow, ragged breath answered him, but this time he could hear a faint clicking noise in the background, like teeth snapping together in the dark. He turned the radio off completely. The air in the clearing felt suddenly heavy, as if the barometric pressure had plummeted in a matter of seconds. The sky above the canopy shifted from a pale, overcast gray to a bruised, unnatural purple. A light snow began to fall, but as a flake landed on the sleeve of his green uniform, Elias realized it was not snow. It was fine, pale ash. There were no active forest fires anywhere in the region, and the nearest thermal geyser capable of producing such debris was over 20 miles away. The ash fell silently, coating the melted tent and the silent clearing in a thin layer of gray dust. Elias knew he had to leave. He had a patrol cabin waiting for him about 4 miles south, a sturdy log structure with heavy iron locks and a wood stove. He placed the journal into his waterproof pouch, turned his back on the campsite, and began to walk. The hike to the cabin took 2 hours, and the entire way, Elias could not shake the feeling of being paced. He heard no twigs snap, no heavy footsteps in the underbrush, but the woods were entirely devoid of wildlife. Not a single squirrel chattered, and no birds called from the high branches. The silence was oppressive, heavy enough to make his ears ring. Every time he stopped to check his compass, he felt a strange, cold pressure on the back of his neck, the distinct sensation of being observed by something that understood exactly what he was doing. When the small, dark shape of the Thorofar patrol cabin finally appeared through the trees, Elias felt a wave of relief so intense it made his knees weak. He unlocked the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and immediately threw the deadbolt. He pulled the thick iron shutters across the 2 small windows, plunging the single-room cabin into darkness. He used his flashlight to find the woodpile in the corner and quickly built a fire in the cast iron stove. The fire caught, but the flames burned with a strange pale blue hue, casting long, twisting shadows against the log walls. Elias sat in the only chair, his radio turned off, the heavy quiet of the cabin wrapping around him. He ate a cold ration bar and tried to rationalize what he had seen. A freak lightning strike, anomalous geothermal activity, a collective psychological break among the survey team. He repeated these theories to himself, trying to build a wall of logic against the creeping dread in his stomach. Night fell completely. The temperature outside plummeted to the single digits, and the logs of the cabin began to groan and pop in the extreme cold. It was near midnight when the silence was finally broken. The radio, which Elias had securely clipped to his tactical vest and powered down hours ago, suddenly crackled to life on its own. The green indicator light flickered in the dim room. A voice began to speak through the speaker. It was not the dispatcher. It was Elias's own voice, recorded from his earlier attempt to call for help. He heard himself say, "Yellowstone Dispatch, this is Thorifar Patrol." But the audio was distorted. It was slowed down, dragged out into a deep, guttural drawl, and underneath his own words, he could hear that same wet, rhythmic breathing. The playback looped 3 times, growing slightly louder with each repetition before cutting off into dead silence. Elias did not move. He sat frozen in the chair, his eyes locked on the radio. Then, a sound came from outside. It was not the wind. It was a soft, heavy thud against the exterior wall of the cabin, about 10 feet away from the door. It sounded like a wet sack of flour being dropped against the wood. A few seconds later, another thud hit the wall, this one higher up, near the roofline. Then came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a scratching noise, slow and deliberate, dragging along the logs toward the shuttered window. It did not sound like claws. It sounded like bare, rigid fingers scraping against the timber. Driven by a terrifying compulsion he could not explain, Elias stood up and walked silently to the window. His hand trembled as he gripped the iron latch of the shutter. He opened it just a fraction of an inch, creating a tiny slit to peer out into the clearing. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but the pale ash covering the ground provided a faint, ghostly illumination. Standing at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, were 3 figures. They were wearing the bright yellow and gray winter parkas of the missing geological team. But they were not acting like lost hikers. They were standing perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder, facing away from the cabin. Their heads were tilted back at an extreme, impossible angle, staring straight up into the pitch-black sky. They did not shiver in the freezing wind. They did not move a single muscle. Elias watched them for what felt like hours, unable to look away, until the pale light of dawn finally began to bleed over the horizon. When the sun broke through the clouds, the figures were gone. Elias waited until mid-morning before unbarring the door. He stepped outside, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He walked to the edge of the tree line where the figures had stood. The layer of frost and pale ash was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints leading into the clearing, and none leading away. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist when the light touched them. Elias packed his gear, locked the cabin, and began the brutal 30-mile hike back to civilization. He did not stop to rest, and he did not turn on his radio again. 2 days later, Elias sat in a brightly lit, windowless office at the park headquarters in Mammoth Hot Springs. He sat across from his sector supervisor, a stern man who listened quietly as Elias recounted every detail of the melted tent, the ash, the journal, and the figures in the dark. When Elias finished, he placed the small green journal on the desk. The supervisor stared at it for a long time, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. The supervisor pushed the folder across the desk. He spoke in a flat, bureaucratic tone, stating that the geological survey team had emerged safely from the south entrance of the park 3 days prior. They had reported a minor equipment failure and decided to cut their expedition short. Elias opened the folder. Inside was a checkout log from the south entrance gate. It listed 3 names, complete with signatures and vehicle plate numbers. But as Elias read the names, a cold knot formed in his chest. The names on the checkout sheet did not match the names of the researchers he had been sent to find. He looked up at his supervisor, pointing out the discrepancy. The supervisor simply picked up the green journal, placed it into a heavy gray lockbox behind his desk, and told Elias that altitude sickness and isolation often cause severe auditory and visual hallucinations. He advised Elias to take a mandatory 2 weeks of paid leave, heavily implying that any further discussion of the incident would result in a permanent psychological discharge. Elias took the leave, and shortly after, requested a transfer to a different park entirely. He never returned to the thoroughfare. His detailed handwritten report was never entered into the digital database. If you search the public records for a missing geological team in the fall of 2012, you will find absolutely nothing. But among the veteran backcountry rangers of Yellowstone, a quiet rumor still circulates. They say that if you find yourself near the thermal vents of the deep thoroughfare late in the season and the temperature suddenly drops, you should never look out the windows of the patrol cabins. They say that sometimes when the sky turns purple and the ash falls, you can still hear the static on the emergency channels playing back a slowed, distorted voice accompanied by the sound of wet, rhythmic breathing. Next story. The Siege of the Little Men. There is a specific kind of darkness that blankets the rural American South in late summer. It is not just an absence of light, but a heavy, suffocating presence, thick with the humidity of August and the deafening drone of cicadas. In the farming community of Kelly, Kentucky, the nights belong to the cornfields. The towering stalks sway in the warm breeze, creating a wall of shadows that stretches for miles in every direction. If you scream out there, the sound is swallowed by the earth. If something approaches from the depths of those fields, you will not see it until it is standing right at your door. On the evening of August 21st, 1955, 11 people were crammed inside the small, unpainted Sutton farmhouse. It was a modest home, devoid of running water or a telephone, sitting isolated at the end of a long dirt driveway. The family was winding down from a long day of brutal heat. Around 7 in the evening, a visiting friend named Billy Ray Taylor stepped out the back door to draw a bucket of water from the well. He barely made it to the pump. He came rushing back inside, his face pale and slick with sweat, claiming he had just watched a massive, glowing metallic object streak across the twilight sky and land silently in a deep gully just beyond the edge of the property. The others in the house dismissed him. They reasoned it was a shooting star or perhaps a trick of the fading light. Billy Ray insisted, but the stifling heat of the house sapped any energy for argument. The matter was dropped until the farm dog in the yard began to bark. It was not the usual territorial warning. It was a frantic, terrified shrieking that ended abruptly as the animal scrambled under the foundation of the house, refusing to come out. A heavy silence fell over the property, drowning out even the chorus of the insects. Elmer Lucky Sutton, the patriarch of the house, exchanged a long look with Billy Ray. Neither man spoke, but both moved toward the corner of the room. Lucky picked up his 12-gauge shotgun. Billy Ray took up a .22 caliber hunting rifle. They loaded the chambers, the metallic clatter of the mechanism sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. They opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, peering into the dense blackness of the yard. At first, there was only the rustling of the corn, then they saw it. Emerging from the tree line, roughly 40 feet away, was a faint, luminous glow. As it moved closer, the glow took the shape of a figure. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, with an oversized head and massive, glowing yellow eyes that sat flush against the sides of its face. Its arms were grotesquely long, spindly appendages ending in sharp talons that nearly dragged on the grass. The most unnatural thing was the way it moved. It did not walk. It seemed to float, gliding over the uneven ground with a swaying, weightless motion, its hands raised in the air as if surrendering, yet it kept coming steadily toward the men. Fear, primal and cold, gripped the two men. When the creature closed the distance to roughly 20 feet, Lucky raised the shotgun. At that range, a 12-gauge blast is utterly devastating. He pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot shattered the quiet night, a massive burst of flame illuminating the yard. The buckshot struck the creature squarely in the chest. But there was no blood, there was no tearing of flesh. Instead, a sharp, ringing sound echoed across the yard. Tring. It sounded exactly like a bullet striking an empty metal bucket. The force of the blast flipped the creature backward in a somersault, but it did not scream. It merely righted itself, uninjured, and scrambled away into the deep shadows on all fours, moving with the terrifying speed of an insect. Lucky and Billy Ray backed into the house, slamming the wooden door and throwing the deadbolt. Panic erupted inside. The women grabbed the frightened children, dragging them into the center of the house, away from the exterior walls. The home had instantly transformed from a sanctuary into a wooden box, surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable dark. They turned off all the lamps, plunging the rooms into pitch blackness to avoid silhouetting themselves against the windows. The men positioned themselves at the glass, their hands trembling, gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles ached. The siege had begun. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing. Then, a soft scraping sound came from the dining room window. Lucky moved cautiously toward the doorway. Framed in the glass, pressed directly against the pane, was a pale, glowing face. The enormous yellow eyes stared unblinking into the dark house. Billy Ray fired the rifle right through the glass. The window exploded outward in a shower of shards. The bullet found its mark, but again, the sound of metal striking metal rang out. The creature simply dropped out of sight, disappearing below the sill. The men realized they had to ensure the perimeter was clear. They crept out the front door, stepping onto the small concrete porch, aiming their weapons into the yard. As Billy Ray took a step forward, a clawed hand reached down from the low, overhanging awning of the roof. Pale fingers twisted violently into his hair, pulling him upward. The women inside screamed. Lucky spun around, shoved his shotgun barrel upward toward the roof, and fired blindly. Another metallic ricochet cut through the smoke. The grip released, and the creature tumbled onto the ground, quickly scurrying out of sight into the brush. They retreated inside once more, barricading the door. It was then that the true horror of their situation settled over them. Their weapons, the heavy firearms designed to stop a man or a wild beast in its tracks, were entirely useless. They were trapped miles from town, surrounded by a sea of corn, defending their family against entities that could not be killed. Then came the sound. The farmhouse roof was made of corrugated tin. The thin metal amplified every movement above them. It started as a soft pressure, the creak of weight settling onto the panels. Then the scraping began. The sharp, rhythmic drag of talons moving across the ridges of the tin roof. Scrape, drag, scrape. The family sat frozen in the center of the living room, breathing in the stale air and the acrid smell of spent sulfur, listening as the weightless footsteps paced back and forth directly over their heads. They could hear multiple creatures up there communicating in strange, high-pitched chattering noises. Every few minutes, a glowing face would slowly rise at one of the windows, peek inside, and duck away before the men could raise their guns. The psychological torture of the invasion wore them down. The constant scratching, the terrifying metallic ping of their useless bullets, the glowing eyes in the dark. By 11 at night, the terror reached a breaking point. The family could no longer endure the claustrophobia of the dark house. On a desperate signal, all 11 people bolted from the front door, piling violently into the 2 family cars parked in the yard. They turned the keys, the engines roaring to life, and sped down the dirt driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as they fled toward the highway. They drove blindly into the city of Hopkinsville, arriving at the police station in a state of absolute hysteria. The police chief noted that these were hardened country people, yet they were trembling so violently they could barely speak. The children were catatonic with fear. Recognizing the genuine terror in their eyes, the chief assembled a massive response. City police, state troopers, and military police from the nearby Fort Campbell Army Base formed a heavily armed caravan and drove back to the Kelly farmhouse. They arrived to find the property silent. The officers scoured the yard with high-powered flashlights. They found the shattered window. They found dozens of spent shotgun shells and rifle casings littering the grass. They noticed a strange, luminous patch on the ground where one of the creatures had been shot and knocked over, a patch that glowed faintly green in the beam of their flashlights. But there were no bodies. There were no tracks. Finding no immediate threat and assuming the trespassers had fled, the vast police presence slowly packed up and left. The last cruiser rolled down the dirt driveway at roughly 2:15 in the morning, leaving the exhausted Sutton family alone once again. The family locked the doors and huddled together in the living room, desperately hoping the nightmare was over. The house was quiet. The crickets had begun to chirp again. The heavy southern heat pressed down on the roof. Then, at 3:30 in the morning, a soft scrape echoed from the kitchen. Lucky turned his head slowly. Rising steadily from the bottom edge of the broken kitchen window, bathed in a faint, sickly glow, were two massive yellow eyes. The scratching on the tin roof resumed. The metallic drag of claws echoed through the wooden rafters. The creatures had merely waited in the high corn for the police to leave. The siege continued for another 2 hours. The men fired their remaining ammunition, listening in despair to the agonizing, hollow ping of bullets bouncing off the unearthly invaders. The family sat helpless in the dark, watching the shadows move outside, waiting for the walls to give way. It was not until the first faint light of dawn broke over the horizon at 5 in the morning that the creatures finally retreated, slipping back into the deep woods and the endless rows of corn, never to be seen again. The Sutton family did not stay to see another night. They packed their belongings and abandoned the farmhouse shortly after. They left behind a home scarred by bullet holes and shattered glass, and a quiet farming town that would never completely wash away the stain of that August night. But worst of all, they carried away the lingering memory of the dark, the useless weight of a loaded gun, and the endless, terrifying sound of claws dragging across a metal roof.